Take a moment, close your eyes, and picture this. You're walking through a museum. The halls are quiet, the lights are soft, and everywhere you look, stone faces are staring back at you from thousands of years ago. Kings, queens, warriors, gods, ancestors. Now, I want you to look closer. Something feels off. One statue. The nose is gone. Another. Same thing. No nose. Then another and another. It's the same damage. Again and again and again. You start to realize this isn't random. This isn't just the result of time passing or a few clumsy accidents. The damage is too specific, too consistent. It feels deliberate. Imagine someone, hundreds or even thousands of years ago, taking tools in their hand and striking these faces on purpose. They didn't target the ears, or the forehead, or the chin. They went for the nose. Always the nose. Why? Who would do this? And more importantly, what were they trying to hide? Tonight, we're going to unmask the vandalism. Tonight, we follow the evidence, tracing the history of this strange and targeted destruction. Tonight, we ask a question that museums rarely answer out loud. Who chiseled the noses from ancient African statues? And what truth were they so desperate to erase? Join me as we uncover the story hidden in plain sight. A story about power, belief, and the fight to control history itself. This is a journey into the heart of where breaking a statue is about more than just destroying stone. It was about attempting to destroy a soul. Let's begin. Have you ever looked closely at an ancient Egyptian statue? I mean, really looked at the towering figures of pharaohs, the serene faces of queens, the detailed carvings that have stood for thousands of years? You probably noticed something. A lot of them have broken noses. And for years, the common explanation was simple. Time. The natural wear and tear of centuries, the unforgiving desert winds, the occasional clumsy tourist. It makes sense, right? A nose is a prominent feature. It sticks out. It's bound to break off first. That's the story we've been told. That's the story I believed. But what if that story isn't the whole truth? What if the damage isn't just accidental? What if it's intentional? Because here's the thing, most people don't realize. This damage is not rare. It's not just one or two statues in a museum. It's thousands. It's a widespread, systematic pattern of destruction. Across Egypt, across Sudan, across ancient Nubia, spanning the entire African Nile Valley. You see it everywhere once you start looking. Pharaohs with their noses deliberately chiseled off. Queens with their entire faces scraped away. Sacred figures of gods and goddesses defaced. Royal ancestors viciously attacked. If simple time and erosion were the culprits, wouldn't the damage be more random? Wouldn't we see just as many broken ears, or chipped shoulders, or weathered hieroglyphs? But we don't. The focus is overwhelmingly on the face, and specifically, the nose and eyes. Time doesn't pick and choose its targets, but people do. And when you start seeing this pattern, you can't unsee it. It stops looking like random decay and starts looking like something else entirely. It looks like a message. A deliberate, violent message. A message that says, erase this identity. Erase this face. Erase this history. So why? Why would someone go to such lengths to disfigure these ancient masterpieces? The answer is more complex and far more profound than simple vandalism. In ancient Egyptian belief, a statue wasn't just a representation of a person. It was a vessel for their spirit, their life force. What they called the statue was a physical home for the soul on earth. And the way for the soul to breathe and receive offerings was through the nose. So, if you wanted to kill the spirit within the statue, you'd break its nose. You'd cut off its breath. It wasn't just about destroying an object. It was about destroying a person's eternal life. It was a form of spiritual execution. This was done by rival pharaohs, trying to erase the memory of their predecessors. It was done by early Christians and Muslims, who saw the statues as pagan idols and sought to neutralize their spiritual power. Tomb robbers did it too, not just for greed, but out of fear that the statue's spirit would seek revenge. Each broken nose tells a story of conflict, of changing beliefs, of a battle for power that stretched beyond life and into the afterlife. The sheer scale of this destruction points to a conscious, widespread effort to rewrite history by force. But there's another layer to this story, a more recent and controversial one. Some scholars and historians argue that many of these faces were defaced for a different reason. To erase their African features, they point out that many of the statues clearly depict people with broad noses and full lips features, characteristic of African people. The argument is that later invaders and colonizers, particularly Europeans, in the 18th and 19th centuries, couldn't reconcile the grandeur of ancient Egypt with their own prejudices about Africa. So, they physically altered the evidence. They broke the noses to obscure the statue's ethnic identity, making it easier to claim that ancient Egyptians were white or Middle Eastern, and not part of Black history. This is a powerful and deeply contentious idea. It reframes the damage not just as ancient political or religious conflict, but as a modern act of racism, an attempt to steal a legacy. While many mainstream Egyptologists are skeptical and point to evidence of ancient the pattern is undeniably there. The focus on the nose and lips in so many cases is hard to ignore. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How much of what we think we know about ancient Egypt has been filtered through the lens of later biases? How much history has been deliberately broken, chiseled away, and hidden in plain sight? So the next time you see a pharaoh with a broken nose, don't just see it as a casualty of time. See it as a clue, a scar from an ancient war, a spiritual assassination, or perhaps a deliberate act of historical erasure. The truth is, these broken statues might tell us more about the people who damaged them than the people they represent. They are silent witnesses to a long and often violent struggle over identity, power, and the very narrative of human history. The evidence is carved in stone, and it challenges us to keep digging for the full story. For generations, we were taught something strange. We were told that ancient Egypt is this great, unsolvable mystery. We don't know what they looked like, they said. They could have been anyone, anything. But really, anything. Because when you look at the evidence, the statues themselves tell a very different story. Before the damage, before the chisels came out, before the deliberate vandalism tried to erase history, those faces had features. Broad noses, full lips, tightly curled hair, carved meticulously into stone. These weren't accidents of erosion or artistic license. The choice of materials, like dark, granite, and deep black basalt, wasn't random. It was intentional. Artists carve what they see. They sculpt their people, their rulers, their families. They sculpt their reality. And that reality, when you look closely, looked African. Deeply African. Unmistakably African. And for some people, that simple, visible fact was, and still is, deeply uncomfortable. Why? Why would such a clear visual record be a source of discomfort? It comes down to a long history of trying to separate Egypt from its own continent. For centuries, a narrative was pushed that Egypt was a Mediterranean or a Middle Eastern civilization that just happened to be in Africa, but wasn't asterisk of asterisk Africa. This was a convenient story, one that allowed European scholarship to claim the heritage of this incredible civilization without having to acknowledge its Black African roots. Think about it. If you believe that greatness, that philosophy, science, and monumental architecture could only come from certain parts of the world, then an undeniably African Egypt messes up your whole worldview. So, what do? You start to chip away at the evidence. A broken nose here, a conveniently lost inscription there. You relabel artifacts and create ambiguity where there is none. Let's look at the art itself, the tomb paintings, the reliefs, the sculptures. They consistently depict people with a range of brown skin tones, from reddish brown to dark brown. Just like the diverse populations you find across the African continent today, men are often shown with a darker, reddish-brown ochre, while women are sometimes depicted with a lighter, yellowish tone. But this wasn't about race, as we understand it today. It was artistic convention, symbolism. It wasn't an attempt to show they were different peoples. Their neighbors, like the Nubians to the south, are shown with even darker skin, and peoples from the Levant are shown with lighter skin. The Egyptians saw themselves and depicted themselves as distinct from these other groups, firmly rooted in their own African identity. They called their land Kemet, which means the Black Land, referring to the rich, dark soil of the Nile Valley. They saw themselves as the people of that Black Land. Now, let's talk genetics. Modern DNA studies have added another layer to this. Some studies on mummies have shown connections to populations in the Near East, which is often highlighted to downplay the African connection. But this is a selective reading of the science. First, many of these mummies are from later periods, after centuries of Greek, Roman, and Arab rule and migration. Second, and more importantly, other studies, including one by the DNA tribe's S&P analysis, showed that the DNA of pharaohs like Tutankhamun and Amenhotep III has its strongest links to populations in the Great Lakes and southern Africa. This isn't a contradiction. It shows a complex picture, as you'd expect from a civilization that lasted for thousands of years at a major global crossroads. But the foundational element, the indigenous African element, is consistently there, scientifically and artistically. The most powerful evidence, though, is what the ancient Greeks and Romans, the people who actually met them, had to say. Herodotus, the Greek father of history, traveled to Egypt in the 5th century BC and described the people as melancros and olatrici, which translates to dark-skinned and woolly-haired. Other classical writers like Aristotle, Lucian, and Diodorus Siculus made similar observations, comparing the Egyptians' appearance to that of Ethiopians. These weren't people with a modern agenda. They were simply describing what they saw with their own eyes. They saw an African people, so the question isn't, what did the ancient Egyptians look like? The real question is, why have we spent so much time and effort trying to pretend we don't know? The evidence is overwhelming. It's in the stone, it's in the paint, it's in the words of their contemporaries, and it's in their DNA. Ancient Egypt was a powerful, brilliant, and profoundly African civilization, recognizing that truth doesn't take anything away from anyone. It simply gives credit where it has long been overdue and restores a vital piece of human history to its rightful place. So let's slow this down. Let's think like detectives, because history, in many ways, is a crime scene. And statues, well, they're the evidence. They are witnesses, silent and stoic, carrying stories etched not just in their creation, but in their destruction. If you look closely at a statue where the nose is shattered naturally over centuries, the break is messy, it's uneven, random. It tells a story of time, wind, and rain. The stone simply gives way to the elements, a slow, patient erosion. But when an OC is deliberately chiseled off, the marks are clean. They are direct, focused. You can almost see the tool marks, the sharp edge of a chisel, the blunt force of a hammer strike. This isn't nature taking its course. This is an act of intentional force. This is vandalism. It's a deliberate act of erasure. Someone, at some point in history, stood right in front of these ancestors, right in front of these powerful figures carved from stone. They raised a tool, felt its weight in their hand, and made a decision. This face should not exist. This identity should be broken. Just take a moment and imagine that scene. Imagine the mindset required to do such a thing. Imagine the hatred, or perhaps the profound fear, that drives a person to attack a block of stone. What could possibly motivate someone to wage war on an inanimate object? It's because when you attack a statue, you're not just attacking rock. You're attacking memory. You're attacking an entire identity. You're attacking a people's claim to their own history, their own truth. This act of iconoclasm, the destruction of images, is a pattern we see repeated across cultures and throughout time. It's a political act, a declaration of power. When a new ruler or a conquering army takes over, one of the first things they often do is deface the symbols of the old regime. Why? Because a statue is more than just art. It's a symbol of authority, of legitimacy, of cultural presence. By breaking its nose, by gouging out its eyes, you are symbolically blinding and silencing the power it represents. You're saying, your gods are powerless. Your kings are defeated. Your history is over. In ancient Egypt, this was a common practice. Pharaohs would have the names and images of their predecessors erased from monuments to rewrite history in their own favor. It was a way to sever the connection between the people and their past, to create a historical vacuum that only the new ruler could fill. The broken noses on so many pharaonic statues aren't accidental. They were precise. Targeted attacks meant to suffocate the statue. The ancient Egyptians believed that a statue housed the spirit of the person it represented, and breathing happened through the nose. To break the nose was to kill the spirit within, to stop it from breathing in the afterlife. It was a spiritual execution. This wasn't just an ancient phenomena. Think of the Reformation in Europe, where Protestant iconoclasts smashed the statues of Catholic saints, seeing them as idols that stood in the way of a direct relationship with God. Or consider the destruction of the Buddhas of Bamiyan by the Taliban, a devastating act aimed at wiping out a piece of pre-Islamic cultural heritage. In every case, the target is the same: the physical representation of an idea, a belief, or a history that the destroyers want to obliterate. So, when we walk through a museum and see these fragmented faces, we're not just looking at damaged artifacts. We are standing before the evidence of a historical battle. Each missing piece tells a story of conflict, of a clash of ideologies, of a struggle for dominance. These broken statues are not just passive victims of time. They are casualties of war. A war fought over narrative, over who gets to be remembered and how. They are a powerful, physical reminder that history is not a settled, peaceful landscape. It's a battlefield. And our job, as detectives of the past, is to read these clues, to understand that a missing nose is not just a missing piece of stone. It's a statement. It's a threat. It's an attempt to shout down the past. But what's remarkable is that even in their brokenness, these statues still speak. Their very damage tells a story of survival, of resilience. They show us that even when someone tries to erase history, the evidence remains. The scars themselves become part of the story, testifying to the violence they endured and the ideas they represented. They force us to ask the crucial question: who did this? And more importantly, why? Thank you for watching. If you found this journey into the past insightful, please like, share, and subscribe for more historical investigations. Now, here's something fascinating. Look at the faces of ancient Egyptian statues. Look closely. What do you see? Or rather, what do you not see? The noses. So many are missing. For centuries, we assumed this was just the result of time, accidents, erosion, the natural decay of millennia. But what if it wasn't an accident at all? What if it was deliberate? In ancient Egyptian belief, statues weren't just art. They weren't decorations to beautify a temple or a tomb. They were believed to be alive, spiritually alive. The Egyptians believed that a part of the soul, which you can think of as the life force or the spiritual double of a person, could inhabit a statue after death. These statues weren't just representations, they were vessels. This is why offerings of food and drink were made to them. It's why prayers were spoken to them. The statue was a physical home for the spirit, a way for the deceased to continue interacting with the world of the living and to receive the sustenance they needed for the afterlife. It was their connection, their anchor. So, if a statue could be alive, could it also be killed? The answer is yes. And the method was chillingly specific. To kill the spirit within the statue, you didn't need to smash it to pieces. You just had to damage one specific part. The nose. Why the nose? Because the nose was the conduit for breath. In Egyptian thought, as in many cultures, breath was synonymous with life. To breathe was to live. By breaking the nose off a statue, you were symbolically suffocating it. You were cutting off its breath, its life force. No nose, no breath. No breath, no life. It was a way to deactivate the statue's power. This act of breaking the nose wasn't random vandalism by tomb raiders just looking for gold. It was a calculated, ritualistic act. Think about the political turmoil in ancient Egypt. When a new pharaoh came to power, they might want to erase the memory and legacy of a predecessor they despised, a political rival, a hated queen, or a king deemed a heretic. How do you ensure they don't just die, but are erased from existence? Even in the afterlife, you go after their statues. You find their images in temples and tombs, and you break the noses. This wasn't just about destroying property. It was a form of spiritual assassination. You weren't just breaking stone. you were attacking their soul. This practice is called iconoclasm, the destruction of images for religious or political reasons. But in LGBT, it was more profound. It was damnatio memoria. The damnation of memory. By breaking the nose, you weren't just ensuring the person was forgotten on Earth. You were attempting to destroy their chance at eternal life. You were severing their connection to the offerings they needed, silencing their ability to receive prayers. It was the ultimate act of revenge, an attempt to kill someone forever. Other parts were targeted too. Ears were broken to stop the spirit from hearing prayers, and hands were smashed to stop them from receiving offerings. But the nose was the most critical. It was the gateway to life itself. So the next time you walk through a museum and see a row of majestic, but noseless, Egyptian pharaohs and queens, don't just see the damage of time. See the echoes of an ancient power struggle. See a deliberate act of spiritual warfare. A story of fear, revenge, and the profound belief that a person's essence could live on in stone, and just as surely be extinguished from it. What we see as simple damage is actually evidence of a belief system so powerful that breaking a statue's nose was seen as a way to commit murder in the afterlife. It tells us that these weren't just artifacts. They were once considered living, breathing entities, locked in a silent, eternal struggle for existence. And now the question gets heavier, because once you know this, you realize whoever did this wasn't just vandalizing. They were trying to erase people from existence. Erase their legacy. Erase their story. Erase their claim to greatness. But why? Why go to such extreme lengths? Why attack African statues specifically? Why is this pattern so consistent in African civilizations, but not in European ones? Why do Greek and Roman statues often remain intact, while African rulers are mutilated? That's not a coincidence. That's control. Think about it. We see ancient Greek sculptures in museums, often missing limbs from the passage of time. We see Roman busts, weathered by centuries, but their faces are usually recognizable. The damage is a result of age, of accident, of the slow, inevitable decay that comes for all things. But when we look at the artifacts from ancient Egypt, from Kushé, from Benin, the damage is different. It's deliberate. It's targeted. Noses are systematically broken. Eyes are chiseled out. Inscriptions bearing names are scratched away. This isn't the work of time. This is the work of an enemy. This is an act of historical violence. So, who was this enemy, and what was their goal? The motive goes beyond a simple conquest. When one army defeats another, they might topple statues as a sign of victory. But this is more insidious. Smashing a nose isn't just about breaking a piece of stone. In many African cultures, particularly in ancient Egypt, the statue was believed to be a vessel for the soul, a way for the deceased to live on in the afterlife. The nose was seen as the conduit for the breath of life. To break the nose of a statue was to suffocate its spirit, to kill the person a second time. It was a symbolic assassination designed to sever their connection to eternity. This was a calculated strategy to rewrite history by disfiguring the powerful images of pharaohs, queens, and nobles. Invaders and rival dynasties sought to wipe their predecessors from the collective memory. If you can't recognize a ruler, you can't honor them. If you can't read their name, you can't tell their story. Their accomplishments, their power, their very existence, all fade into obscurity. The new rulers could then insert themselves into the historical narrative, claiming the achievements of the past as their own, or simply pretending those who came before never mattered at all. It was the ultimate form of propaganda, etched in stone. Let's look at the famous case of Hatshepsut, one of the most powerful female pharaohs in history. She ruled for over 2 decades, bringing immense prosperity and commissioning incredible building projects. Yet, after her death, her successor, Thutmose III, went on a campaign to erase her from history. Her statues were torn down, smashed, and buried. Her name was chiseled off temple walls. Her images were recarved to look like male pharaohs. Why? Perhaps he felt his claim to the throne was threatened by her legacy. By erasing her, he solidified his own power and rewrote the line of succession. This wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was a political move to control the narrative of power. This pattern repeats across the continent. The beautiful Benin bronzes, looted by the British in the late 19th century, tell stories of the kingdom's history and its abbas, or kings. Many of these artworks were created to honor ancestors and record dynastic lines. The act of taking them was not just theft. It was the theft of a historical library, an attempt to disconnect a people from their heritage. The defacement and removal of these artifacts were part of a larger colonial project to undermine African identity and justify foreign rule. If a people has no great history, no powerful rulers, no sophisticated art, it's easier to dominate them. It's easier to tell them they need to be civilized. So, when you see a defaced African statue, don't just see a damaged artifact. See the evidence of a struggle for legacy. See the ghost of a person who was so powerful, so important, that their enemies felt the need to attack them, even in death. Their attackers tried to silence them, to erase them, but in a way, they failed. The very scars on these statues tell a story of their own. They tell a story of resilience, of a history so potent that it had to be attacked. And by asking why, by studying these broken faces, we're doing the exact opposite of what the Vandals intended. We're not forgetting, we're remembering. We are piecing the story back together, and in doing so, we are giving them back their voice, their legacy, and their rightful place in human history. In the heart of Egypt, under the scorching sun, lies a mystery carved in stone. A story of a pharaoh, a woman who ruled as a king, whose legacy was almost erased from history. Her name was Hatshepsut. Her monuments, Once Glorious, bear the scars of a deliberate attack. Faces smashed, names chiseled away, an attempt to wipe her from memory. For centuries, the world was told a simple story, that her successor, consumed by jealousy, was the one who ordered this destruction. But what if that story is a lie? What if the real culprit is someone else entirely, hidden in the shadows of the past? To understand who truly tried to erase Hatshepsut, we have to travel through time. We must journey through invasions that swept across the Nile Valley, leaving chaos in their wake, through the rise and fall of mighty empires, each rewriting history to suit their own narrative. We'll navigate the complex era of colonization, a time when foreign powers controlled not just the land, but the story of its past. We'll expose the theft of priceless artifacts, spirited away to distant lands, their origins obscured. We'll walk the hallowed halls of museums, questioning the labels and the stories they present as fact, and we'll challenge the very lies printed in textbooks, the simplified tales that have been taught to generations. Because the chisels that defaced these ancient monuments didn't just strike stone. They struck history itself. They were weapons in a war for memory, a battle over who gets to be remembered and who is forgotten. The act of erasure was not a simple fit of rage. It was a calculated, political move with consequences that rippled through to today. Every missing piece, every scarred wall, is a clue. And what we uncover next, piecing together evidence from archaeology, ancient texts, and modern science, will challenge everything you thought you knew about ancient Egypt, power, and the enduring fight for a place in history. The truth is far more complex and far more fascinating than the story we've been told. Join me as we unravel this ancient conspiracy. This is the real story of the war against Hatshepsut, and it changes everything. Let's go back. Far, far back. Long before museums, long before textbooks, long before the word Africa even existed. Let's journey back to the Nile. This wasn't just a river, it was the lifeline of a civilization, the world's longest river, flowing like a silver snake through desert gold. On both sides of that river, there was life. Green fields stretched to the horizon. Papyrus reeds swayed gently in the wind. Farmers were busy planting grain, their hands deep in the rich, dark soil. Children ran barefoot through the mud, their laughter echoing across the water. Boats, sleek and silent, slid across the river's surface, carrying goods and people from one bank to another. And rising above it all were the monuments. Massive, silent, unshakable. Temples carved directly from mountainsides. their entrances looming like gateways to another world. Obelisks, single shafts of stone, reached toward the sky as if trying to touch the sun god Ra himself. Colossal statues stood watch over entire cities, their stone faces, some 50 feet tall, gazing out with an eternal, knowing expression. This was a civilization so advanced, so organized, and so powerful that even today, with all our modern technology, we still don't fully understand how they built it all. This was the land of Kemet, what we now call Egypt. But here's something crucial to understand. Ancient Egypt wasn't separate from Africa. It wasn't some isolated island, and it certainly wasn't a southern outpost of Mediterranean Europe. It was African. Geographically, it's rooted in the northeast corner of the continent. Culturally, its traditions and innovations were deeply intertwined with its neighbors. Genetically, its people were indigenous to the land, and spiritually, its beliefs were part of a wider African cosmology. It was connected south to the powerful kingdom of Nubia, connected west to the cultures of the Sahara, connected to the very heartbeat of the entire continent. And the people, the original people of Kemet, they looked like the land they came from. They were people of the sun. Their skin was kissed dark by its powerful rays. Their features were strong, reflecting the resilience of a people who built an empire from the desert. They had broad noses, full lips, and tightly curled hair. You don't have to take my word for it. The evidence is carved in stone. The statues, the reliefs, the paintings, they show it clearly. Before the damage, before the invading armies arrived with their chisels, before the deliberate erasures began, the stone told the truth. The faces of the pharaohs, the queens, the priests, and the everyday people reflected their African origins. Then came the invaders, the Hyksos, the Assyrians, the Persians, then the Greeks, led by Alexander, and after them, the Romans. Each wave of conquest brought new rulers, new cultures, and new faces. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which included Cleopatra, were Greek rulers. They ruled from Egypt, but they were not of Egypt. They brought their own art styles, their own language for government, and their own worldview. Over centuries, the population of Lower Egypt, especially around the new capital of Alexandria, began to change. Intermingling was inevitable. The original Kemetic identity didn't vanish overnight, but it was slowly, systematically buried. The Romans solidified this shift. They treated Egypt as a breadbasket, a province to be exploited. The cultural center of gravity shifted further toward the Mediterranean, and with the rise of Christianity and later Islam, the ancient religion, the hieroglyphic language, and the pharaonic traditions faded into memory. The great temples were abandoned or converted. The old ways were forgotten. This wasn't just a change of government. It was a cultural erasure. The connection to its deep African roots was deliberately severed. Scholars from Europe arrived centuries later and saw the pyramids, the Sphinx, the temples, and they couldn't, or wouldn't, reconcile these incredible achievements with the African people they saw around them. So they created a new story. A story that placed Egypt firmly in a new category. The Orient, the Middle East, or even a misplaced extension of Europe. They chiseled the noses off statues to obscure their features. They categorized and racialized the people, claiming the rulers were a different, lighter-skinned race than the masses they governed. This academic sleight of hand was the final erasure, writing the true identity of Kemet out of its own history. The civilization that was born from the heart of Africa was repackaged and sold to the world as something else entirely. But the stones remember. The genetics don't lie. And the spirit of Kemet, the great African civilization of the Nile, is a truth that can no longer be buried. Picture a sculptor standing in the heat, chisel in one hand, hammer in the other. Before him sits a massive block of black granite. He isn't just guessing what a king looks like. He is not inventing a fantasy. He is carving someone he has seen, someone he knows. Maybe it's someone he's stood next to, or even someone he bows to every day. Every single strike of his hammer is intentional. Every curve is deliberate. The cheekbones, the eyes, the lips, and especially the nozzle, carefully shaped, proud, and distinct. Why is this so important? Because in ancient cultures, art was documentation. It recorded reality. These statues weren't cartoons or abstract interpretations. They were portraits, meant to capture the true likeness of a person. This leads us to a powerful conclusion. If thousands of ancient statues clearly show African features, that wasn't symbolism. It was observation. It was truth, frozen in stone for millennia. This brings us to a critical question. If this evidence is so clear, why isn't it common knowledge? The answer lies in the history of invaders, empires, and the first erasures. When one culture conquers another, it doesn't just take land and resources. It often seeks to rewrite history, to erase the identity of the conquered people. One of the most effective ways to do this is to destroy their art, their records, their statues. Think about it. If you can break the nose off a statue, you can obscure its features. You can create ambiguity. You can begin to plant a new narrative. Consider the Great Library of Alexandria, a treasure trove of ancient knowledge, burned to the ground, or the countless artifacts looted from Africa, Asia, and the Americas, now sitting in museums far from their homes, their original context lost. This isn't accidental. It's a systematic process of cultural erasure. When invaders deface a statue, they are not just breaking stone. They are trying to break the link between a people and their past. They are trying to say, you are not who you think you were. Your ancestors did not look like this. Your achievements are not your own. This is why those noses are so often missing from ancient Egyptian and Nubian statues. It was a deliberate act to obscure the African identity of these powerful civilizations. The goal was to disconnect them from their legacy, to make it easier to claim their achievements as the product of another people. By erasing the face of the past, you can control the narrative of the present and the future. This pattern isn't unique to one time or place. It has happened all over the world. When the Spanish arrived in the Americas, they destroyed Aztec and Incan codices, burning centuries of history and knowledge. They replaced indigenous temples with churches, superimposing their own culture over the one that existed before. The message was clear. Your history starts with us, but history is resilient. Truth has a way of enduring, even when it's been buried under layers of falsehoods. The evidence is still there, in the statues that survived, in the fragments of texts that were saved, in the oral traditions passed down through generations. The features are still visible, even on a broken statue. The language still holds clues. The DNA still tells a story. Our job now is to be historical detectives. It's to look at the evidence with fresh eyes, to question the narratives we've been taught, and to piece together the truth that was so deliberately shattered. We must ask why certain histories have been suppressed and others promoted. We must reconnect the dots that were intentionally broken. When we see a statue with a broken nose, we shouldn't just see vandalism. We should see an attempt to erase a history. We should see the ghosts of an empire trying to rewrite its own story by destroying someone else's. And by understanding this, by recognizing the act of erasure, we take the first step in reclaiming that history. We honor the sculptor who stood in the heat, carefully carving the truth into stone. We give voice to the ancestors whose faces were stolen. We begin to understand that the story of humanity is far richer, more diverse, and more interconnected than the history books have often led us to believe. The stones still speak, if we only learn how to listen. But history is never peaceful for long, because whenever a civilization becomes wealthy, powerful, and admired, someone else always wants it. And the Nile Valley, the land the ancient Egyptians called Kemet, was rich beyond imagination. It wasn't just about gold, though they had mountains of it, mined from the eastern deserts. It wasn't just about the precious ivory traded up from the heart of Africa. It was so much more. The Nile's annual flood made their land incredibly fertile, producing a surplus of grain that could feed their people and be traded across the ancient world. This abundance created stability, and from that stability grew something even more valuable: knowledge. They developed sophisticated trade routes that became the arteries of commerce, connecting Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. Their priests and scribes charted the stars, developing a calendar so accurate it formed the basis of the one we use today. This was astronomy born from necessity, used to predict the floods and guide their agricultural society. Their understanding of medicine was legendary. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents in the world, details their knowledge of surgery, pharmacology, and anatomy, showing a level of sophistication that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. And then there was their architecture, the pyramids, the temples of Karnak and Luxor, the Sphinx. These weren't just buildings, they were statements of power, faith, and cosmic order, engineered with a precision that still baffles us. They were masters of stone, creating monuments designed to last for eternity. So, to the outside world, to the burgeoning kingdoms and nomadic tribes that surrounded them, Kemet wasn't just impressive. It was irresistible. It was a beacon of wealth, a treasure house of wisdom, and a symbol of ultimate power. And as history teaches us time and time again, irresistible things attract invaders. The first major foreign power to successfully conquer parts of Egypt were the a people from Western Asia, around 1650 BCE. They swept in, bringing with them new military technologies like the composite bow and the horse-drawn chariot. Things the Egyptians had never seen before. They established their own dynasty in the Nile Delta, ruling over Lower Egypt for more than a century. For the proud Egyptians, this was a profound shock, a deep humiliation. The divine order, the concept of Mat that governed their worldview, had been shattered. But this invasion also planted a seed. It forced the Egyptians to adapt, to learn from their conquerors. They adopted the chariot, mastered the composite bow, and fundamentally transformed their military. When the Theban princes in the south finally rose up and drove the Hyksos out, Egypt was not the same. It was stronger, more militarized, and more determined than ever to prevent such a violation from happening again. This experience led to the birth of the new kingdom, the Age of Empire. This was the era of warrior pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramesses the Great. They didn't just wait for invaders to come to them. They projected their power outwards. They marched their new, formidable armies into the Levant, into Nubia, creating a buffer zone and establishing an empire that stretched from modern-day Sudan to Syria. They weren't just defending their wealth anymore. They were actively seizing the resources and tribute of other nations to fuel their own grand projects back home. The temples grew larger, the tombs more elaborate, and the treasury overflowed with foreign gold. But empires are difficult and expensive to maintain, and Egypt's wealth continued to be a magnet. From the west came the Libyans, who at times managed to take the throne itself. From the south, the Nubian kings of Kush, once Egypt's subjects, rose to conquer their former masters, establishing their own dynasty as the 25th dynasty of pharaohs. They saw themselves not as foreign conquerors, but as restorers of traditional Egyptian values. Then came the great powers of the age. The vast Assyrian Empire, with its brutal and efficient military machine, swept down from Mesopotamia, sacking the great city of Thebes. They were followed by the even larger Persian Empire under Cambyses II, who defeated the last native Egyptian pharaoh and incorporated the land of the Nile into his immense domain. For the first time, the pharaoh was a foreigner living in a distant capital. And finally, Alexander the Great arrived. After defeating the Persians, he was welcomed in Egypt as a liberator. He respected their culture, was crowned pharaoh, and founded the city of Alexandria, which would become the new center of learning and culture in the Mediterranean. After his death, his general, Ptolemy, took control, establishing a Greek-speaking dynasty that would rule Egypt for 300 years, culminating in its most famous figure, Cleopatra. Through all of this, a slow and subtle process was taking place. Each wave of invaders, each new empire, brought their own language, their own gods, their own culture. While Egyptian culture was remarkably resilient, influencing its conquerors as much as it was influenced, the old ways began to fade. The Greek language of the Ptolemies, and later the Latin of the Romans, became the languages of administration. New religions, particularly Christianity and later Islam, began to supplant the ancient pantheon of gods. The final blow came when the ability to read hieroglyphs was lost, a key turning off the lights of a 3,000-year-old civilization. The voices of the pharaohs fell silent. This is the story of the first great cultural erasure in history. It wasn't a single event, but a slow, grinding process of conquest, assimilation, and forgetting. The wealth and knowledge that made Kemet so irresistible ultimately led to its downfall as an independent culture, but its legacy never truly died. It was preserved in stone, in papyrus, and in the DNA of later civilizations. The Greeks, the Romans, and all who followed stood on the shoulders of these African giants. The story of ancient Egypt is a powerful lesson in how greatness can invite its own destruction, and how a culture can be erased, only to be rediscovered thousands of years later. First came the wars. It started small, with neighboring kingdoms just testing the borders, skirmishes kicking up dust along the desert edges. But then, the forces grew larger. Foreign armies started appearing on the horizon, speaking different languages, worshipping different gods, and carrying very different ambitions. First, it was the Assyrians, then the Persians. After them, the Greeks, and then the Romans. It was wave after wave, century after century. Each new power arrived with the exact same thought. This land, this civilization, is just too valuable to be left alone. And so, they conquered. They ruled. They marched into the capital, replaced the leaders, and planted their own flags. They renamed the cities, trying to make the foreign feel familiar. But every single time power changed hands, something else changed too. Something less obvious than a name on a map. Memory. Because conquerors don't just take land, they take the story that goes with it. They rewrite history to place themselves at the center. And this is exactly where statues become dangerous. Why? Because statues remember. Long after the kings have died and their bodies have turned to dust, the stone still speaks. Long after the armies have packed up and marched away, the monuments still stand, silent witnesses to what came before. A statue is more than just a carving. It's a declaration. It says, this person ruled here. It says, this culture thrived here. It says, these people built this. And if you're a new conqueror trying to claim all that glory for yourself, that's a huge problem. The physical evidence completely contradicts your new narrative. You can't stand in a grand hall and say, we built this glorious empire from nothing, while the faces of hundreds of African kings and queens stare back at you from the temple walls. You can't proclaim your own unmatched greatness while someone else's powerful face dominates the skyline. So, what do? You can't destroy everything. That would take far too much time, too much effort. It's impractical. Instead, you get strategic. You target identity itself. You attack the face. You see, a statue without a face is anonymous. It's a ghost. You can chip away at the nose, the lips, the eyes, the very features that give it a personal story. Bidongtisio. Not just vandalizing a piece of art, you're performing a targeted assassination of history. You're trying to erase a person from time itself. Imagine walking through a temple and seeing row after row of powerful figures, all of them systematically defeated. The message is clear. The people who came before don't matter anymore. Their legacy is cancelled. The new rulers are sending a powerful signal to the conquered people. Your heroes are gone. Your history is void, and your identity is now ours to define. It's a psychological tactic, a way to break the spirit of a civilization by severing its connection to its own past. And this wasn't a one-time thing. It happened again and again with each new empire that swept through. Each conqueror would see the monuments of the last and think, I can't let their story overshadow mine. So, they'd continue the cycle of erasure. They would chisel away at the symbols of their predecessors, all while erecting their own new statues, knowing full well that their monuments might face the same fate one day. This is why, when we look at ancient artifacts today, we see so many damaged faces. It's not always the result of time or accidents. Often, it's the scar tissue of history, the physical evidence of a long and brutal war over memory itself. The story of these invaders is not just about battles and territory. It's about the deliberate, systematic effort to control the past as a way of controlling the present and the future. They knew that if you can erase a people's history, you can control their destiny. But as these statues show, even in their damaged state, they still tell a powerful story of resilience, a story that refuses to be completely silenced. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, consider subscribing for more stories hidden in history. The face is personal. The face is human. It tells you who someone is, where they come from, what their story is. But what happens when you change the face? When you remove a crucial part, like Tenos? Suddenly, the features blur, the story changes, and And that's exactly what some people wanted. For centuries, we've looked at ancient Egyptian statues with their noses and lips deliberately broken off. And for just as long, historians have used this damage to create doubt. They'd say things like, well, maybe they looked different. Maybe they weren't actually African. Maybe. We're just not sure. Maybe. 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 Becomes a weapon. Doubt is a powerful tool, because once a people begin to doubt their own past, they start to doubt themselves, their capabilities, their heritage, their place in the world. This wasn't accidental damage. It was a targeted act of erasure. Imagine this scene. An invading soldier, centuries ago, stands in the grand hall of an ancient temple. Dust motes dance in the flickering torchlight. All around him, towering statues of pharaohs and gods, carved from dark, formidable stone, stand silent. They are watching in their presence. He feels small, insignificant. These monuments, these silent giants, scream a powerful truth at him. You are not the first here. You are not the greatest here. Someone came before you. Someone stronger. Someone more brilliant. And that truth threatens his entire sense of superiority, the very foundation of his conquest. So, what does he do? He can't topple the entire statue, it's too massive. But he can disfigure it. He can rob it of its identity. He picks up a heavy mallet or a hammer. He steps up to the stone face, raises his arm, and brings it down with force. Crack. Stone chips fly. He strikes again. Crack. And again. He focuses his energy on the most defining features. The broad nose. Tiffle leaps. He hammers away until the nose collapses, until the face is a ghost of its former self, until its identity is shattered. This wasn't just random vandalism. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare. Every broken nose sent a clear, brutal message to the conquered people. It said, your gods are powerless. Your kings are dead and defeated. Your history, your memory, your identity. It all ends here. By erasing the face, the invaders tried to erase the people. They understood something fundamental. To control the future, you must first control the past. They didn't just break stone. They were trying to break a spirit, to sever a connection to a glorious legacy that they could never claim as their own. But legacies are resilient. The truth is written in stone, and even when chipped and broken, it refuses to be completely silenced. These statues, even in their damaged state, still tell a story. They tell a story of greatness, and they tell a story of the desperate, violent attempts to hide that greatness from the world. We are now piecing that story back together, looking past the damage to see the truth that was always there. The faces may have been attacked, but the spirit behind them was never truly broken. Now, multiply that moment by thousands, across centuries, across temples, tombs, and entire cities. This was systematic, repeated, intentional. This wasn't just one angry person acting out in a single moment of rage. No, this was a pattern, a behavior, a deliberate strategy, because every conqueror, every invader, understood something very simple, something fundamental. If you control the past, you control the future. And for centuries, this was the primary method of control. Armies would sweep through, bringing down monuments, defacing statues, and burning libraries. It was a physical conquest, a brute force attempt to rewrite history by destroying the evidence. But then came something even more devastating. Not just invasion, not just conquest, but colonization. This was a different kind of control. It wasn't waged with swords, but with narratives. Not with armies, but with textbooks. It wasn't about destruction alone. It was about distortion. Because centuries later, after the initial waves of physical destruction had settled, Europe would look back at Africa and say something truly outrageous. A statement so bold, so fundamentally untrue, it's hard to comprehend. They would say, Africa has no history, no civilization, no great achievements. Think about that for a second. Imagine standing in front of the pyramids of Giza, structures older than the city of Rome itself, and declaring that the people who built them had no history. Imagine saying that while walking through the grand temples of Karnak or Abu Simbel, complexes carved from mountains with a precision that baffles engineers even today, and claiming there were no great achievements. Imagine holding intricate artifacts crafted by master engineers, astronomers, and artists, and dismissing them as primitive. How could such an audacious lie possibly take hold? How could it become the dominant narrative for so long? Well, the lie only works if the evidence is damaged, if the stories are silenced, if the faces are gone. The lie becomes plausible only if the identity of the creators is blurred, made ambiguous, or erased entirely. The lie only works if the noses are missing. This wasn't just about breaking stones. It was about breaking a connection. It was an attempt to sever a people from their heritage, to make them forget who they were and what their ancestors accomplished. If you can convince a people that they have no past worth remembering, you can more easily convince them that they have no future worth fighting for. The physical erasure was the first step. The second was the psychological one, the rewriting of history books, the creation of a global story where one continent was the hero and another was a blank page waiting to be written upon. But history is resilient. Truth, even when buried, has a way of resurfacing. The stones still speak, even when they're broken. The art still tells a story, even when it's defaced. The achievements are still there, etched into the very landscape, waiting for us to look past the damage and see the original masterpiece. The story of what was lost is just as important as the story of what was built, because it teaches us about the enduring power of culture and the desperate lengths some will go to extinguish it. Reclaiming that history, piece by broken piece, isn't just about correcting the past. It's about building a more honest future. So now we know something important. The vandalism didn't start randomly. It began with power, with fear, with conquerors trying to erase the people they replaced. We've seen how empires rose and fell, and how new rulers often tried to wipe the slate clean by literally defacing the past. They hammered away at the images of old gods, chiseled off the names of forgotten kings, and tore down monuments to build their own. It was a brutal, physical act of rewriting history, a declaration that screamed, "We are in charge now. You are forgotten." This was the first wave of erasure, born from the battlefield and the thirst for dominance. But what happens next is even more shocking, because the story doesn't end there. In fact, it takes a turn that's quieter, more insidious, and arguably even more devastating. Because later, the destruction wouldn't just happen on battlefields. It would happen in museums, in excavations, in so-called scientific studies. The very places we trust to protect and explain history became the new front lines for its alteration. Think about that for a second. The damage was no longer done with the crude force of a soldier's hammer, but with the precise tools of an archaeologist, the pen of a historian, or the authority of a curator. It happened in the name of research, in the name of preserving history, and sometimes the people claiming to save and celebrate African heritage were the very ones reshaping it, chiseling it, editing it, and hiding it from public view. They weren't just digging up artifacts. They were digging up narratives and then reburying the parts they didn't like or couldn't understand. And that's where this story gets really uncomfortable, because the next suspects in our investigation don't look like ancient warriors. They wear suits, not armor. They hold degrees, not spears. And their tools aren't swords and shields. They're narratives, they're theories, they're the stories we are told in textbooks and the labels we read in museum halls. The power to erase history shifted from the conqueror to the academic, from the battlefield to the lecture hall. These new gatekeepers of the past decided what was important, what was authentic, and what was best left unsaid. And in doing so, they continued a different kind of vandalism, a cultural erasure that could be just as permanent. Stay with us as we uncover how these modern narratives were constructed and who was left out of the picture. Now, here's where the story takes a turn most people don't expect. Because it's easy to blame ancient invaders. It's easy to picture soldiers with hammers, smashing priceless art. It's easy to imagine war and chaos, destruction happening in the heat of battle. That's the story we're often told, right? The simple one. But what if I told you that some of the most significant damage didn't happen during war at all? What if some of it happened during what was called research? What if it happened during preservation? During exploration? What if the very people claiming to protect African history were sometimes the same ones reshaping it to fit their own narrative? Not with swords, not with fire, but with tools that seemed harmless. With labels that quietly rewrote stories, with brushes that scrubbed away context along with the dirt, with catalog numbers that stripped artifacts of their spiritual and cultural meaning, reducing them to mere objects, and with quiet decisions made behind the closed doors of museums, thousands of miles away from the communities that created them. This wasn't a loud, violent conquest. It was a silent one. A conquest of meaning. When European archaeologists and anthropologists arrived in Africa during the colonial era, they weren't just digging for artifacts. They were digging for a version of history that suited them. They controlled the narrative. They decided what was important, what was primitive, and what was worthy of display in their grand institutions. Artifacts that told complex stories of advanced African societies were sometimes misinterpreted, or worse, ignored. Statues were given new, incorrect names. Sacred objects were labeled as simple tools. The intricate web of a culture's beliefs, traditions, and history was untangled and rewoven into a simpler, more digestible story for a Western audience. A story that often reinforced colonial ideas of superiority. This wasn't just about collecting things, it was about controlling the past. And by controlling the past, you control the present and the future. The damage wasn't just physical breakage. It was a breakage of legacy, a severing of connection between a people and their heritage. And this is the quiet cover-up that we are only now beginning to fully understand and confront. Fast forward, thousands of years pass. Empires rise and fall. Temples sink into the sand. And magnificent statues collapse, their secrets buried with them. Great cities, once bustling with life, disappear beneath the endless desert. For a long, long time, the ancient world sleeps, covered, hidden, protected by the slow march of time itself. Then comes the 1700s and the 1800s. The age of European expansion dawns. This is an era of ships crossing vast oceans, flags being planted in what was, to them, foreign soil. Maps were redrawn, entire continents reshaped by distant hands. Africa was divided like a pie at a dinner table, with little regard for the people who lived there. This was the age of colonialism. But colonialism wasn't just about controlling land and resources. It was about something far more powerful. The control of knowledge. Because knowledge is power, and whoever gets to write history, well, they own the story. So, European explorers, soldiers, and scholars started fanning out across the globe. They arrived in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in lands rich with forgotten history. Armed with shovels and a sense of entitlement, they began to dig. They called it archaeology, a noble pursuit, the quest for knowledge, or so they sighed. But was it really? Imagine this. A team of British archaeologists in the 1880s, standing in the Valley of the Kings. They've just uncovered a pharaoh's tomb, untouched for 3,000 years. The air is thick with dust and discovery, golden chariots, intricate jewelry, stone sarcophagi covered in hieroglyphs. It's the find of a lifetime. But where does it all go? Does it stay in Egypt, the land of its creators? No. Crate after crate is packed up and shipped off to London, to Paris, to Berlin. The treasures of a civilization become exhibits in a foreign museum. This wasn't just a one-time thing. It was a system. From the Elgin marbles taken from Greece to the Benin bronzes plundered from modern-day Nigeria, a pattern emerges. The story being told was a European one. These objects weren't presented as the achievements of vibrant, sophisticated African or Middle Eastern cultures. Instead, they were framed as relics of a dead past, rescued from neglect by a superior civilization. The narrative was subtle but clear. We discovered it, we saved it. Therefore, we own it. This process created what we can call a silent cover-up. The very act of removing these artifacts from their homes stripped them of their context. A statue of a god isn't just a piece of art, it's an object of worship. a focal point for a community. A royal mask isn't just a beautiful bronze. It's a sacred part of a coronation ceremony. When you put it in a glass case thousands of miles away, it loses that meaning. It becomes just a thing to be looked at. The story of its people, their beliefs, their traditions, gets muted, sometimes erased entirely, and this created a distorted view of history. European museums became the self-appointed gatekeepers of world culture. They decided which stories were important and how they should be told. And for a long time, the story they told was that history, real history, was something that happened in Europe. The rest of the world was just a footnote, a source of exotic artifacts. Think about the message this sends. For generations, people from colonized countries have had to travel to Europe to see their own heritage. Their history was held captive, presented through a colonial lens. It's a powerful way to reinforce a sense of cultural inferiority. It quietly says, your past isn't truly yours until we validate it. Now, fast forward to today, the world has changed. The old empires have fallen. Countries have reclaimed their independence, and a new conversation is happening. A loud one. Nations are demanding their stolen heritage back. Egypt wants the Rosetta Stone from the British Museum. Nigeria is demanding the return of the Benin bronzes. Greece continues its fight for the Parthenon marbles. This isn't just about returning old objects. It's about rewriting the story. It's about decolonizing our museums and our minds. It is about acknowledging that the history of humanity doesn't belong to one group of people to display as they see fit. It's a shared story, and every culture has a right to be its own storyteller. The fight for repatriation is a fight for historical justice. It's about breaking the silence and finally letting these amazing artifacts tell their full, true stories back where they belong. The conversation is shifting, but there's a long way to go. What do you think? Should museums return these items? Let me know in the comments below. Have you ever walked through a museum, marveling at ancient Egyptian artifacts, and wondered how they all got there? The story we're often told is one of heroic discovery, but the truth is a lot more complicated. Let's go back to the 19th and early 20th centuries. European explorers arrive in Egypt and Sudan, lands rich with the treasures of ancient civilizations, but pay close attention to the language they used to describe themselves. They didn't call themselves treasure hunters or looters, even though that's what many were doing. No, they called themselves archaeologists, scholars, scientists, men of discovery. It sounds so noble, doesn't it? So respectable. It paints a picture of brave adventurers carefully unearthing history for the good of all mankind. But what actually happened on the ground? Picture this. Vast teams of local Egyptian and Sudanese workers are hired for pennies. They do all the back-breaking work, digging in the scorching sun, moving tons of earth and stone, and carefully extracting priceless artifacts from their ancient resting places. They are the ones with the local knowledge, the skill, and the endurance. Yet, when the work is done, who gets the credit? The European archaeologist who stands by, overseeing the operation, often from the shade of a tent. He's the one who poses for the photographs. His name is the one that gets published in the papers back home, and he's the one who decides where these treasures go. And where do they go? Not to local museums in Cairo or Khartoum. They are packed into crates and shipped thousands of miles away to fill the halls of museums in London, Paris, Berlin, and Boston. These artifacts, the very soul of a nation's heritage, are taken to become centerpieces in foreign collections. The local people who unearth them are erased from the story. Their contributions are forgotten, their labor uncredited. This wasn't just a few isolated incidents. It was a system, a colonial enterprise dressed up as scientific pursuit. The discovery was really a removal. The preservation was really a possession. And museums became the grand showcases for this looted heritage, presenting it with neat little labels that tell a sanitized story of archaeological expeditions, conveniently leaving out the part about colonial power, exploitation, and the silencing of the true discoverers. It's a silent cover-up that has shaped how we see ancient history for generations. So the next time you're in a museum, look a little closer at that mummy sarcophagus or that golden statue. Ask yourself the uncomfortable questions. How did it really get here? And whose story isn't being told? Have you ever walked through a museum, marveling at ancient Egyptian artifacts, and wondered how they all got there. The story we're often told is one of heroic discovery, but the truth is a lot more complicated. Let's go back to the 19th and early 20th centuries. European explorers arrive in Egypt and Sudan, lands rich with the treasures of ancient civilizations, but pay close attention to the language they used to describe themselves. They didn't call themselves treasure hunters or looters, even though that's what many were doing. No, they called themselves archaeologists, scholars, scientists, men of discovery. It sounds so noble, doesn't it? So respectable. It paints a picture of brave adventurers carefully unearthing history for the good of all mankind. But what actually happened on the ground? Picture this. Vast teams of local Egyptian and Sudanese workers are hired for pennies. They do all the back-breaking work digging in the scorching sun, moving tons of earth and stone, and carefully extracting priceless artifacts from their ancient resting places. They are the ones with the local knowledge, the skill, and the endurance. Yet, when the work is done, who gets the credit? The European archaeologist who stands by, overseeing the operation, often from the shade of a tent. He's the one who poses for the photographs. His name is the one that gets published in the papers back home, and he's the one who decides where these treasures go. And where do they go? Not to local museums in Cairo or Khartoum. They are packed into crates and shipped thousands of miles away to fill the halls of museums in London, Paris, Berlin, and Boston. These artifacts, the very soul of a nation's heritage, are taken to become centerpieces in foreign collections. The local people who unearth them are erased from the story. Their contributions are forgotten, their labor uncredited. This wasn't just a few isolated incidents. It was a system, a colonial enterprise dressed up as scientific pursuit. The discovery was really a removal. The preservation was really a possession. And museums became the grand showcases for this looted heritage, presenting it with neat little labels that tell a sanitized story of archaeological expeditions, conveniently leaving out the part about colonial power, exploitation, and the silencing of the true discoverers. It's a silent cover-up that has shaped how we see ancient history for generations. So the next time you're in a museum, look a little closer at that mummy sarcophagus or that golden statue. Ask yourself the uncomfortable questions. How did it really get here? And whose story isn't being told? Imagine it's early morning. The desert air is still cold, but the sun is already beginning its climb. On T-ground, local workers are digging, their sweat mixing with the sand. Brushes scrape, shovels move earth, and then a sound, the unmistakable thud of metal hitting stone. A shape emerges, a face from the ground, a statue, buried for centuries, perfectly preserved. A king, a queen, a god. Features intact, nose intact, identity intact. For thousands of years, it lay untouched, a silent testament to a glorious past. And then, foreign hands lift it from the soil. They wrap it in cloth, load it onto a cart, and begin a long journey. But this journey isn't to a nearby village or an African university. It's a journey across the sea, to London, Paris, Berlin, New York. Taken, catalogued, displayed, thousands of miles from home, a cultural orphan in a foreign land. This story isn't just about one statue. It's the story of countless artifacts. Look at the British Museum, the Louvre, the Met. What do you see? You see the spoils of empire. You see the Rosetta stone, the Benin bronzes, the Elgin marbles. These aren't just beautiful objects. They are stolen history, ripped from their context. We're told they were discovered or excavated by brave European archaeologists. But let's call it what it was. Looting on an industrial scale, often justified by racist ideologies that deemed the local people unfit to care for their own heritage. Think about the sheer audacity. Imagine someone breaking into your home, taking your family heirlooms, and then putting them on display in their living room, claiming they're preserving them for you. It's absurd, right? Yet this is exactly what happened to entire civilizations. These artifacts were not found in empty lands. They were taken from living cultures, often through violence, coercion, or deceit. They were part of active religious sites, royal courts, and community life. Now, let's talk about the silent cover-up. The part of the story that's often left out of the museum placard. When you look at many of these ancient statues, particularly from Egypt, you might notice something is missing: the noses. For years, the official explanation was simple: erosion, the wind, the sand, the passage of time. It sounds plausible, doesn't it? But is it the whole truth? Many scholars and historians are now challenging this narrative. They argue that much of this damage wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Why would someone intentionally break the nose of a statue? In ancient Egyptian belief, statues were seen as vessels for the soul. To breathe, the spirit needed a nose. Smashing the nose was an act of iconoclasm, a way to ritually kill the statue and sever its connection to the divine or the person it represented. This was done by rival pharaohs, by early Christians trying to erase paganism, and yes, by Colonial some 19th century archaeologists, steeped in the racist pseudoscience of their time, couldn't accept that a great civilization could have been built by black Africans. So they defaced the evidence. They broke the broad noses and full lips that linked these ancient rulers to the people of the continent. It was a way of erasing blackness from history, of making it easier to claim this heritage as their own. So the next time you walk through a museum, look closer. Look past the beautiful lighting and the hushed reverence. Ask yourself, how did this get here? Whose hands first touched it? Whose history is being told? And whose is being silenced? The display case isn't a neutral space. It's a political one. It's the final scene of a crime, a silent testament to a history of extraction and erasure. The conversation about restitution is growing louder, and it's a conversation we all need to be a part of. These objects are more than just art. They are the soul of a people, and it's time for them to go home. And here's the part that really stinks. Once these artifacts were taken from their homes and shipped thousands of miles away to Europe, they didn't just change location, they changed identity. Suddenly, these sacred objects, these pieces of history, were being interpreted through colonial eyes. And let's be honest, colonial eyes had a very specific agenda. It was an uncomfortable one, and it was built on a lie. You see, for centuries, Europe had been telling itself a story about Africa. A convenient story that justified their actions. It was a story that painted a picture of a continent that was primitive, a place with no real civilization, no great history to speak of. It was a narrative designed to make one group feel superior and another inferior. But the artifacts told a completely different story. They were the inconvenient truth. These statues, these bronzes, these carvings, they didn't whisper, they screamed. They screamed of intelligence, of advanced engineering, of a deep understanding of astronomy and mathematics. They showcased breathtaking art and undeniable power. They were physical proof that Africa was never behind the world. In fact, Africa helped build the world. The continent was a cradle of innovation, culture, and sophisticated societies long before European ships ever appeared on the horizon. And that truth clashed violently with colonial ideology. It was a direct contradiction to the narrative they had so carefully constructed. So, what do you do when the evidence doesn't fit your story? You change the evidence, or, more accurately, you change how it's presented. Instead of celebrating these objects as proof of advanced African civilizations, they were often labeled as primitive art or tribal crafts. The complex societies that created them were downplayed or ignored entirely. The Benin bronzes, for example, were so sophisticated that early European scholars couldn't believe they were made by Africans. They came up with wild theories, suggesting they must have been made by lost Portuguese artisans, or even ancient Egyptians, anyone but the Edo people themselves. It was a systematic effort to silence the true story these artifacts were trying to tell. The museums became stages, and the artifacts were props in a play that reinforced colonial superiority. The narrative was controlled. The labels were carefully worded. The context was stripped away. What was once a symbol of a king's divine right became just a curious, exotic object in a glass case. This wasn't just collecting. It was an intellectual and cultural suppression. The history wasn't just stolen, it was rewritten. And for over a century, the world has been looking at this edited version of history, displayed in the grand halls of Western museums. The cover-up wasn't just silent, it was deafening. Let's talk about something subtle that happens in museums. Something that isn't always violent or obvious, but is incredibly powerful. It's a silent cover-up, a rewriting of history that happens right in front of our eyes, on the little plaques and descriptions next to ancient artifacts. You see, for decades, a quiet change has been taking place. The language used to describe who these ancient people were has been systematically altered. It's a strategy of doubt, a way to muddy the waters of history. Take, for example, a bust of an ancient ruler with clear African features. Where the label once might have accurately read African king, you'll now find something vague, like Near Eastern type. A powerful sculpture of a black ruler. The description has changed to Mediterranean features. And what about a depiction of a proud Nubian queen? Suddenly, she's of uncertain origin. That word, uncertain, is a weapon. It shows up everywhere. You'll see it time and time again, even when the evidence is staring you right in the face. Even when the sculptures, the paintings, and the historical records are clear, even when the features are obvious and undeniable, they still write uncertain. Why? Because when you repeat a word enough, it starts to sound like the truth. Doubt becomes policy. And when doubt becomes the official policy of our most trusted institutions, it does one thing very effectively. It hides the truth. It erases entire legacies, whitewashes history, and denies people their heritage. This isn't just about dusty artifacts and glass cases. It's about who gets to claim a place in history. The language on these labels matters because it shapes our understanding of the past and, by extension, our understanding of the present. They're replacing Afrikaan with uncertain, black with Mediterranean, and Nubian with unknown. It's a subtle shift, but it's a deliberate one. It's an attempt to remove Africa from its own history, one label at a time. And by doing so, they are not just misrepresenting artifacts. They are silencing the voices and legacies of entire civilizations. We need to start questioning this language. When you walk through a museum and see the word uncertain, ask yourself, uncertain for whom and why? The truth is often not as uncertain as they would like us to believe. We have to look closer, read between the lines, and demand that our institutions tell the whole, unvarnished story. You know, sometimes this whitening of history went even further than just scrubbing off the paint. There are documented cases, and this is where it gets really insidious, where ancient statues were restored. Now, on the surface, restoration sounds like a good thing. It sounds harmless, preservation, taking care of our past. But restoration, in this context, can mean something else entirely. It can mean reshaping, recarving. Imagine this. A restorer, chisel in hand, isn't just cleaning a statue. They're smoothing out features that seem too ethnic. They're narrowing a nose that seems too broad, softening lips that appear too full. Bit by bit, they are Europeanizing these ancient faces. These are tiny changes, often so subtle that most people looking at the final product would never notice. You'd have to compare it to the original, pre-restoration photos to see the difference. But these small alterations are big enough to completely shift the identity of the person depicted. Because when you change the face, you change the perceived race. And when you change the race, you change the entire narrative. This wasn't just accidental. It was a deliberate act to align these ancient civilizations with a European ideal. Let's take the Great Sphinx of Giza, for example. For centuries, European travelers and scholars described its features as distinctly African. But over time, especially after colonial influence grew, that description started to change. There are accounts and sketches from the 18th and 19th centuries that show a systematic erosion of its original features, not just from time, but from deliberate damage. The nose is the most famous part that's missing. And while the exact cause is debated, this loss conveniently helped to de-Africanize one of the world's most iconic monuments. It's a pattern we see repeated. Statues from ancient Egypt, from Nubia, from Mesopotamia cultures with deep African and Middle Eastern roots were subtly altered to fit a Greco-Roman mold. The goal was to create a historical lineage that flowed directly and exclusively to Europe. By making these powerful ancient figures look more European, it reinforced the colonial idea that civilization, art, and power were inherently European concepts. It allowed them to claim these histories as their own, while simultaneously erasing the people who actually created them. Think about the psychological impact of this. 4 generations. People have walked through the halls of the world's most famous museums and seen a version of history that has been literally whitewashed. They see statues of powerful pharaohs and queens that look vaguely European and subconsciously absorb the message that the great achievements of the ancient world were the work of people who looked like them. This creates a false sense of historical inheritance and superiority. Meanwhile, for people of African, Middle Eastern, or other non-European descent, it creates a profound sense of disconnection from their own heritage. When you don't see yourself represented accurately in the story of human civilization, it can feel like your ancestors didn't contribute, that they were merely on the sidelines of history. This erasure is a form of cultural violence. It robs people of their legacy and perpetuates harmful myths about race and capability. So the next time you're in a museum and you're looking at an ancient statue, especially one from Egypt or the surrounding regions, look closely. Look at the nose, the lips, the shape of the face. Ask yourself, does this reflect the people of that region? Or does it reflect a later European ideal? Question what you're seeing. The silent cover-up of our shared history is all around us, carved in stone. But it's a silence we can break by learning to see what's really there and what's been deliberately taken away. This is a conversation we need to keep having. Think about how dangerous that is. A statue survives 3,000 years of desert storms, wind, and sand, only to be corrected in a European workshop. Corrected. As if the original African features were some kind of mistake, as if history itself needed editing. That's not preservation. That's manipulation. It's a quiet violence against the past, rewriting features to fit a more comfortable, more Eurocentric narrative. It's the ultimate act of historical gaslighting, telling an entire civilization that their image wasn't good enough, that it needed to be fixed. And once you start seeing it, you can't unsee it. You walk through these grand halls and you start to question everything. What else has been altered? What stories have been silenced with a chisel and hammer? And then there's something else. Something most people never even think about when they visit a museum. We see the polished floors, the perfectly lit displays, the little placards with neat descriptions. But what we're seeing is just the tip of the iceberg. The real story, the vast majority of the collection, is hidden Hawaii. I'm talking about the storage rooms, not the exhibits, not the pretty galleries, but the basements, the climate-controlled archives where thousands upon thousands of artifacts sit unseen. They are crated, stacked, and cataloged, but they are never displayed. They are never discussed in the public sphere. And you have to ask yourself, why? Why would a museum acquire these priceless pieces of history only to lock them away in the dark? The answer is uncomfortable. It's because not everything fits the story they want to tell. Every museum, whether consciously or not, curates a narrative. It's a story of art, of history, of civilization. But that story has been predominantly written by a very specific group of people. And when an artifact challenges that narrative, when it shows a history that's more complex, more diverse, or more inconvenient than the accepted version, it becomes a problem. What do you do with a piece that proves a primitive society was actually highly advanced, or an artifact that clearly shows cultural exchange, where the official story claims there was only conquest? You don't have to destroy it. That would be too obvious, too crude. Instead, you just quietly remove it from view. It disappears into the archives. It's not destroyed, just hidden. And hiding something can be just as effective as destroying it. Because if nobody ever sees it, if no one is there to ask questions about it, it might as well not exist. It's a silent cover-up, a form of censorship that happens right under our noses, and the very institutions we trust to preserve our collective memory. The artifacts are safe. Technically, they're preserved, but the stories they hold, the truths they could tell, are effectively silenced. They're trapped in a state of suspended animation, waiting for a time when we're finally ready to hear their full story. This isn't just about a few forgotten pots or statues in a basement. This is about the integrity of our history. It's about who gets to decide what is remembered and what is forgotten. When we walk into a museum, we're not just looking at old objects. We are consuming a story, and we have to be critical about who is telling that story and what they might be leaving out. The real work of understanding history often begins by asking what isn't on display. We need to demand more transparency. We need to ask for the keys to the basement, metaphorically speaking. Imagine this. Your ancestors built magnificent monuments, structures that have defied time and survived for millennia. Imagine the pride, the connection you'd feel to that legacy, and then one day, someone takes them. They don't ask. They is a take. They're shipped thousands of miles away, across vast oceans, to a foreign land. They're put behind cold, sterile glass in a sprawling museum, and right next to these pieces of your heritage, someone writes a new story. A story that isn't quite right. It's their version, their interpretation. It erases the context, simplifies the complexity. And sometimes, it's just plain wrong. And the final irony, they charge you money to see your own history. Think about that. That's not education. That's possession. It's not preservation for all. It's narrative control. It's a continuation of a very old story. What we could call intellectual colonization. Remember our original question from the start of this journey? Who chiseled the noses off the statues? It seems like a simple question, but the answer is anything but. By now, I hope you realize something. Chilling, it wasn't just one group of people. It wasn't just one era in history. This desecration happened in layers, like the peeling of an onion, each layer revealing a different story of erasure. First, you have ancient invaders. Rival kingdoms and conquering armies would often deface the symbols of the rulers they overthrew. It was a power move, a way of saying, your gods are powerless. Your kings are forgotten. They chipped away at the identity of their predecessors, asserting their own dominance. Then came the religious iconoclasm. As new faiths swept across the continent and the world, adherents of these new beliefs sometimes saw the old gods and sacred figures as pagan idols that needed to be destroyed. It was a zealous act, born from a conviction that they were purifying the land. They broke the statues, burned the temples, and chiseled the faces to destroy their spiritual power. And then, we enter a more recent and perhaps more insidious phase. The era of colonial collectors and European archaeologists. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as European powers carved up Africa, they didn't just take land and resources. They took history. Expeditions, often funded by museums back home, swarmed ancient sites. They saw themselves as discoverers and saviors of these artifacts, ignoring the fact that these objects already belonged to living cultures. The damage they did was twofold. First, the physical act of removal was often brutal. Statues were sawn apart for easier transport. Sites were excavated with a shocking lack of care, destroying invaluable archaeological context forever. But the second form of damage was intellectual. Once these artifacts were in Western museums, a new narrative was constructed. Scholars, steeped in the racial biases of their time, struggled to accept that magnificent civilizations like ancient Egypt or Nubia were African. They proposed theories of foreign influence, suggesting that these achievements must have come from outside the continent. This is where the silent cover-up truly takes hold. By controlling the interpretation, they controlled the perception of history itself. The narratives they wrote often downplayed the African identity of these civilizations, creating a distorted view that has persisted for generations. So, when we look at that noseless statue, we're seeing the work of many different hands over many centuries, all contributing to the same outcome. Ancient invaders, religious zealots, colonial collectors, and biased scholars. Different motivations, different methods, but the result is the same. African identity blurred, history obscured, a legacy fractured. It happened over and over and over again. This isn't just about stone and gold. It's about memory, identity, and the right of a people to tell their own story. The fight to reclaim these artifacts is also the fight to reclaim that narrative. But here's the thing they didn't expect. Stone remembers. Science remembers. DNA remembers. And now, people are asking questions. A new generation of historians, brilliant African scholars, and fiercely independent researchers are looking closer. They're zooming in, examining the microscopic tool marks on these ancient artifacts. They're dusting off old excavation photos, poring over the details that were once overlooked. They're reading forgotten journals, the private thoughts and hurried notes of those early colonial archaeologists. And as they connect the dots, they're realizing something incredibly powerful. The damage isn't random. The broken pieces, the missing fragments, the conveniently lost context wasn't just a series of unfortunate accidents. The story that we've been told, the one presented in pristine museum cases, isn't accidental either. The erasure, the silencing of a whole civilization's achievements, was systematic. Think about that for a second. It wasn't just about digging up treasures. It was about digging up a history and then deliberately breaking it. It was about controlling the narrative. They chose which pieces to display and which to hide. They decided which stories were worth telling and which were to be buried all over again. This systematic erasure served a purpose. By presenting these incredible African achievements as primitive, or even as the work of some lost foreign civilization, it reinforced the colonial agenda. It created a justification for their presence, a narrative that they were bringing civilization to a land that supposedly had none. It was a calculated act of historical vandalism on a massive scale. It's a difficult truth to confront, but we have it too. The evidence is there, hidden in plain sight, in the very chisel marks and fractures of the stone. The silence from the past is finally being broken, and the real story, the one that was intentionally shattered, is being pieced back together. Have you ever walked into a museum and felt like you were only getting half the story? That feeling is real. For centuries, our most prestigious institutions have been complicit in a silent cover-up, especially when it comes to colonial archaeology. They present artifacts as simple relics of the past, but there's so much more. They are pieces of a story, often a story of conquest, appropriation, and erasure. Think about it. We see beautiful objects in glass cases, with neat little labels telling us where they're from and how old they are. But what don't those labels say? They don't tell us how these objects were acquired. Were they gifts? Were they traded fairly? Or were they taken by force during a colonial invasion? Too often, it's the last one. And the museum's silence helps to whitewash a violent history. Archaeology itself was a tool of empire. European explorers and archaeologists would descend on colonized lands, digging up sacred sites and ancestral burial grounds without any regard for the local people. They called it science, discovery. But for the communities whose heritage was being unearthed and shipped away, it was desecration. These weren't just objects, they were cultural lifelines. Items with deep spiritual significance and human remains of ancestors. They were taken to film museums back in Europe, displayed as trophies of a superior civilization's global reach. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You walk into a museum differently. You don't just admire the art. You investigate. You look for what's missing. You notice the broken noses on statues, the vague labels, the half-told stories. You start asking questions. Who wrote this description? Who decided this object's identity? Who benefits from this particular version of history being told? Because history isn't just about the past. It's about power in the present. The narratives that museums create shape how we see ourselves and others. They can reinforce old colonial hierarchies, or they can challenge them. When museums hide the violent origins of their collections, they perpetuate the idea that this history doesn't matter, that the descendants of the colonized have no claim to their own heritage. Reclaiming the truth is about more than just correcting a historical record. It's about restoring dignity. It's about reclaiming power. So next time you're in a museum, don't just look. Investigate. Ask the hard questions. Demand the full story. But we're not done yet, because there's another layer to this story. An even deeper one that gets right to the core of the problem. Science. Or what was called science at the time. I'm talking about anthropology and the dark history of race theory. This was the period when people literally measured skulls, trying to prove that Africans were an inferior race. It was a time when so-called experts used fake, biased science to justify rewriting the histories of entire civilizations. And trust me, what they did to African history during this era might be the most shocking part of this whole story. This wasn't just about stealing artifacts. It was about stealing a narrative, erasing a legacy, and replacing it with a colonial invention. They looked at incredible achievements, like Great Zimbabwean, and instead of giving credit to the local Shona people who built it, they invented phantom builders from distant lands. Why? Because their racist worldview couldn't accept the idea of a sophisticated African civilization. They claimed it must have been built by ancient Phoenicians, or Arabs, or even the Queen of Sheba but the actual people who lived there. This scientific racism provided the perfect justification for colonialism. If you can convince the world, and even the people themselves, that they have no history of achievement, no culture of their own, it becomes much easier to dominate them. You're not destroying a civilization. You're civilizing a supposedly backward people. This was the intellectual weapon they used, and its effects were devastating. They didn't just take objects from the ground. They took history from the people. And these twisted theories, born from prejudice, found their way into textbooks, lectures, and museum displays, poisoning our understanding of the past 4 generations. The lie became the accepted truth. We'll explore exactly how they pulled this off, and the brilliant minds who fought back to reclaim their history. Stick around, because this is where the story gets really intense. For the past few weeks, we've talked about invaders, armies, conquerors, colonizers, people who used force to take what they wanted. We've seen how they broke statues with hammers and chisels, trying to erase a history that didn't fit their narrative. But what happens when the weapon isn't a tool you can hold in your hand? What happens when the weapon is an idea? Ideas can be far more powerful and last much longer than stone. And sometimes, a single idea can erase more history than any army ever could. This is the story of how a dangerous idea, born in the halls of European academia, tried to rewrite the identity of an entire civilization. It's the story of scientific racism and its attempt to steal Egypt's heritage. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as European powers expanded their empires, they needed a way to justify their dominance over other peoples. They turned to science, or rather, a twisted version of it. Thinkers like Christoph Minners and later, Samuel Geertz Morton began creating racial hierarchy. They measured skulls, analyzed features, and created a ladder of humanity with white Europeans conveniently placed at the very top. Everyone else, Asians, Native Americans, and especially Africans, were placed on the rungs below, deemed intellectually and culturally inferior. This wasn't just abstract theory. It had real-world consequences. It was the intellectual fuel for colonialism, slavery, and systemic oppression. And ancient Egypt presented a huge problem for this worldview. Here was this incredible civilization that predated Greece and Rome, with monumental architecture, complex writing, and advanced knowledge of science and mathematics. European scholars were in awe, but they were also deeply uncomfortable. How could a civilization this great have emerged from Africa, the continent they had labeled as primitive? Their solution was simple and insidious. They decided the ancient Egyptians couldn't have been African. They argued that a superior race, perhaps from Asia or even Europe, must have migrated into the Nile Valley, bringing civilization with them. They claimed the pharaohs and the architects of the pyramids were not native Africans, but a foreign ruling class. This Semitic hypothesis became the dominant theory. Egyptologists and anthropologists selectively used evidence to support it. They pointed to lighter-skinned figures in some tomb paintings, while ignoring the vast majority that depicted a range of brown skin tones, clearly representing the diversity of the Nile Valley. They misinterpreted texts and ignored the Egyptians' own descriptions of themselves and their neighbors. They effectively created a fictional Egypt, one that was geographically in Africa, but racially and culturally detached from it. This wasn't just an academic debate. It was an act of cultural theft on a massive scale. By decoupling Egypt from its African roots, they denied black people a crucial part of their heritage and reinforced the racist idea that Africa had no history of its own. This false narrative was taught in universities and museums for generations, shaping how the world saw Egypt and how Africa saw itself. It was a weaponized idea, and it did more damage to Egypt's identity than any hammer ever could. But ideas, like empires, can also fall. Picture this. It's the late 1800s, rolling into the early 1900s. Europe is a continent in massive upheaval. Factories are roaring to life, their smokestacks painting the skies gray. Cities are exploding with new people, new money, and new ambitions. European empires are stretching their tentacles across the globe, especially into Africa, carving up the continent piece by piece. But amidst all this industrial and colonial frenzy, another power is rising. A new voice of authority that people are starting to trust more than anyone else. It's not the voice of priests from the pulpit. It's not the commands of kings from their thrones. It's the calm, measured voice of scientists, professors, anthropologists, men in sharp suits, clutching notebooks and measuring tools. These were the new high priests of knowledge. Their mantra was simple and powerful. We follow evidence. We follow facts. We follow reason. It sounds completely trustworthy, doesn't it? How could you argue with facts? But here's the dark secret, the twist in the story. Even science, that beacon of objectivity, can be warped by human bias. Even meticulous research can be manipulated to serve the powerful. And even the most respected experts can tell lies, especially when their reputations, their funding, and their entire careers depend on protecting one very specific, very convenient story. A story that justified colonialism and erased the true history of the people they conquered. These scientists went to Egypt, a land with a history so grand it was almost mythical. They saw the pyramids, the Sphinx, the temples, and they were faced with a puzzle that challenged their entire worldview. How could a civilization this advanced, this magnificent, have been built by Africans? In their minds, steeped in the racial hierarchies of the time, it was simply impossible. So, they invented a new story, a false narrative. They created a new race, a brown or a Mediterranean race, specifically for the ancient Egyptians. They claimed these people were not truly African, but a separate group, closer to Europeans. They took measurements of skulls, analyzed mummies, and published papers all to prove a conclusion they had decided on from the very beginning. They weren't following the evidence. They were twisting it to fit their prejudice. This wasn't just an academic debate. This was an act of cultural theft on a massive scale. By denying Egypt its African identity, they were denying Africa one of its greatest legacies. They rewrote history to make it fit their narrative of superiority. The real story of Egypt, a story of a powerful, innovative, and deeply African civilization, was buried under layers of biased science. And for over a century, the world believed their lie. It's a powerful reminder that we must always question who is telling the story and why. Have you ever wondered why for so long the incredible achievements of ancient Egypt were separated from Africa? The answer is a story, a very specific and carefully protected story that Europe wanted to tell the world. The story was simple. Europe equals civilization, and Africa equals primitive. That was the belief. That was the assumption. And most importantly, that was the very foundation of colonial rule. Because think about it for a second. If Africa had great civilizations, if Africa built pyramids that touched the sky, if Africa mastered astronomy and charted the stars, if Africa ruled powerful empires that stretched for thousands of miles, then colonialism has no moral excuse. The entire justification, the whole idea of a civilizing mission in Africa, just completely collapses. So, they couldn't allow that narrative to take hold. They couldn't accept it, even when the evidence was literally staring them in the face. Even when the magnificent statues were looking back at them. Even when the monuments they unearthed were taller than their own grandest cathedrals. They couldn't accept the truth. They needed a different explanation. Any explanation, as long as it wasn't the obvious one. They twisted facts, invented theories, and went to extraordinary lengths to suggest that ancient Egyptians weren't African. They proposed they were from Asia, from Europe, from some mythical lost white race anywhere, but Africa. This wasn't just a simple mistake. It was a deliberate act of historical erasure. It was what we now call scientific racism, using the language of science to justify prejudice. They measured skulls, analyzed features, and created complex racial hierarchies, all designed to do one thing: disconnect Egypt from its African roots. This allowed them to claim Aegis's legacy for themselves, while simultaneously denying the genius of the African continent. This campaign to rewrite history was incredibly successful, and its effects are still felt today. It created a false image of Africa as a continent without history, a land waiting to be discovered and civilized. But the truth is, Africa has always been a continent of innovators, kings, queens, and scholars. By erasing Egypt's blackness, they were trying to erase Africa's greatness. But history has a way of fighting back. Today, Thanks to the tireless work of historians, archaeologists, and scholars, especially those of African descent, we are reclaiming that truth. We're challenging the old, racist narratives and piecing together the real story of ancient Egypt, a story of a powerful, innovative, and profoundly African civilization. Understanding this history isn't just about correcting the past. It's about shaping a more honest and equitable future. So this is what they did. They invented something called scientific racism. Now, hear that phrase carefully. Scientific racism. Two words that should never, ever belong together, but for decades, they did. European scientists and thinkers started ranking humans, literally ranking them, as if people were different species of animals, as if humanity had levels. It's a shocking concept today, but it was mainstream then. And who do you think they placed at the very top of this made-up ladder? Europeans, of course. In their narrative, they were the pinnacle of civilization. In the middle they put Asians and Middle Easterners. And at the very bottom, Africans. This was the hierarchy they taught in universities, printed in textbooks, and published in prestigious scientific journals. It was presented as fact, not opinion. This wasn't some fringe theory. It was the academic consensus of the time, taught to generations of students across the Western world. And once an idea enters textbooks, once it's taught by professors with fancy degrees, it starts to feel like truth. Even when it's complete and utter nonsense, it becomes ingrained, accepted, a part of the cultural furniture. This dangerous idea was used to justify colonialism, to rationalize oppression, and to steal the heritage of entire civilizations. Because if you can convince the world that a group of people is less than, you can justify doing almost anything to them. Now, how does this all connect to ancient Egypt? Well, this is where the story gets even more twisted. The great civilization of the pharaohs, with its pyramids, its advanced mathematics, its incredible art, was undeniably African. It was built on the African continent by African people. But for the European scholars of the 19th century, this was a problem. It didn't fit their racist hierarchy. How could people they placed at the bottom create something so magnificent? They couldn't accept it. It broke their entire worldview, so they had to invent a new story. They had to rewrite history. They argued, with absolutely no evidence, that the ancient Egyptians couldn't have been black Africans. They must have been from somewhere else. Maybe they were a lost white race, or migrants from Asia, or ebon aliens, anything but black and African. They looked at the statues and tomb paintings, and even when the features were clearly African, they explained them away. They measured skulls, a practice called chronometry, twisting the data to fit their preconceived conclusions. This was a deliberate campaign to disconnect Egypt from its African roots. They effectively stole a legacy, erasing a black civilization from history to uphold their racist ideology. For more than a century, this false narrative was the dominant story told in museums, documentaries, and classrooms all over the world. It was a lie, born from scientific racism, that shaped how we all saw the ancient world. But history has a way of revealing the truth. Picture an old, dimly lit laboratory. Sunlight struggles through grimy windows, catching dust motes, dancing in the air. On long wooden tables, a macabre collection is laid out in neat, unsettling rows. Human skulls. Beside them, an array of measuring tools, gleaming calipers, worn tape measures. Men in starched collars lean over these bones, their faces a mixture of intense focus and cold detachment. They are meticulously measuring the circumference of a head, the precise angle of a forehead, the width of a nasal bridge. They jot down numbers in leather-bound notebooks, as if they're solving a complex mathematical equation. This practice had a name: chronometry, and its purpose was chilling. They claimed they were measuring skulls to objectively prove intelligence, to scientifically rank human worth. Their goal was to demonstrate that some races were naturally superior, more advanced, while others were inherently inferior. But here's the crucial twist in this so-called scientific endeavor. The conclusion was already written before a single measurement was taken. The entire process was a sham. They cherry-picked data, manipulated measurements, and ignored any results that contradicted their preconceived biases. If a skull from a supposedly inferior race was larger than one from a superior race, they would claim it was an anomaly or invent a reason, like brain disease, to exclude the Italiano. This wasn't science. It was theater. It was a performance designed to lend an air of legitimacy to deeply ingrained prejudice. The numbers were just props, pretending to be objective truth. The entire field was built on a foundation of lies, designed to justify colonialism, slavery, and systemic oppression. They were attempting to use the language of science to codify racism, to make bigotry look like a fact of nature. And this wasn't just some forgotten chapter of history. The legacy of these false narratives echoes even today. Think about ancient Egypt. For a long time, many of these same pseudoscientists refused to believe that native Africans could have built such a magnificent civilization. So, they invented stories. They claimed the ancient Egyptians must have been a different, non-African race, perhaps from the Near East or Europe, who came and created the pyramids and temples. They pointed to statues and tomb paintings, twisting the art to fit their narrative, ignoring the clear evidence right in front of them. It was a deliberate attempt to erase a people's history, to steal their heritage and rewrite their identity, to fit a racist worldview. The truth is, ancient Egypt was a diverse, powerful, and unequivocally African civilization. The evidence from genetics, archaeology, and historical records all points to this. Recognizing the truth isn't about replacing one story with another. It's about dismantling the old lies that were built on prejudice and restoring the integrity of history. It's about acknowledging the incredible achievements of all peoples without the tainted filter of scientific racism. So let's go back a few centuries. Imagine a group of European scholars, men of science and reason, who are absolutely convinced of one thing: that people of African descent are inherently inferior. This wasn't just a casual prejudice. It was a deeply ingrained, so-called scientific belief. They built entire academic frameworks around it, published papers, and taught it in universities. They believed that intelligence, creativity, and the ability to build great civilizations were exclusive to their own race. It was a neat, self-serving little theory that justified colonialism, slavery, and all sorts of It made them feel secure in their position at the top of the world. Now, guess what happens when these same men, so sure of their theories, walk into Egypt? Imagine their shock. They're standing in front of pyramids that are thousands of years older than the Parthenon in Greece. They're gazing up at colossal statues of powerful pharaohs, figures with distinctly African features. They're trying to comprehend how these inferior people, as their theories claimed, could have built architectural wonders that even modern engineering struggles to replicate. The sheer scale, precision, and artistry of ancient Egypt was a direct, undeniable contradiction to everything they believed. Their entire worldview, their scientific racism, was suddenly standing on very shaky ground. It just didn't add up. So what do you do when the facts punch a giant hole in your favorite theory? The logical, scientific thing to do would be to admit you were wrong. Throw out the old theory and start over based on the new evidence. But that would mean admitting that their entire social and racial hierarchy was a lie. That was a pill too bitter to swallow. So, instead of fixing the theory, they decided to attack the evidence. Not by tearing down the pyramids, of course, but by rewriting the story. They launched an intellectual assault on history itself. They couldn't deny the greatness of ancient Egypt, so they decided to steal it. They invented a new, incredibly convenient idea called the Hamitic hypothesis. This theory proposed that, yes, ancient Egypt was a magnificent civilization, but it wasn't built by black Africans. Oh no. According to them, it was created by a branch of the Caucasian race, a dark-skinned, but not Negroid people. But they called the Hamites. These Hamites, they claimed, swept down into Africa from somewhere in Asia or Europe, brought civilization to the true Africans, built the pyramids, ruled as pharaohs, and then mysteriously vanished or were absorbed, leaving behind their incredible achievements. It was a complete fabrication, a historical fantasy designed for one purpose: to keep their racist theories intact, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Have you ever heard of the Hamitic hypothesis? It sounds like some old, dusty theory, but its impact has been incredibly destructive. Basically, It was a so-called scientific idea that claimed if anything advanced or impressive existed in Africa, it couldn't possibly have been built by native Africans. Never by black Africans. It had to be outsiders. So, who were these mysterious outsiders? Well, the theory invented a fictional group of people they called Hamites. These were supposedly a superior race that swept into Africa from somewhere else, maybe Asia or Europe, and brought civilization to the supposedly uncivilized black populations. They taught them how to build, how to govern, how to create art. Let that sink in for a moment. Instead of acknowledging the genius and innovation of African peoples, they literally invented an entire imaginary race just to avoid giving credit where it was due. This wasn't just some fringe idea. It became a cornerstone of colonial era thinking. It was used to justify European control and exploitation. Think about ancient Egypt, when early European explorers saw the pyramids, the Sphinx, and the temples. Their minds couldn't reconcile these incredible feats of engineering with their prejudiced views of black Africans. So, what did they do? They applied the Hamitic hypothesis. They argued that the ancient Egyptians couldn't have been black Africans. They had to be a branch of this mythical Hamitic race, somehow separate and superior to the people living around them. This created a false narrative that severed Egypt from its African roots. It was a deliberate attempt to rewrite history, to steal a legacy. They measured skulls, analyzed statues with biased eyes, and twisted evidence to fit their preconceived notions. They pointed to certain statues and claimed they had European features, conveniently ignoring the vast amount of evidence to the contrary. Written descriptions from ancient Greeks like Herodotus and modern genetic studies that connect ancient Egyptians to other Northeast African populations. The Hamitic hypothesis is a textbook example of scientific racism. It shows how far people will go, how much they will twist logic and deny reality, just to uphold a system of racial hierarchy. This wasn't about finding the truth. It was about maintaining power. By denying that black Africans were capable of building one of the world's most foundational civilizations, they tried to justify centuries of oppression. But history is being reclaimed. Scholars and researchers are dismantling these old lies, proving that ancient Egypt was, and always will be, a magnificent African civilization. For centuries, a question has lingered over one of history's most magnificent civilizations. Who were the ancient Egyptians? The answer should be simple, right? Egypt is in Africa. But for a very long time, the narrative was twisted, contorted, and rewritten to fit a deeply biased worldview. The prevailing theory, pushed for generations, was that ancient Egyptians couldn't possibly be African. They had to be something else. This idea, rooted in scientific racism, desperately tried to disconnect Egypt from its own continent. Scholars and historians would claim they were Near Eastern, or maybe Mediterranean. The term Caucasian was thrown around a lot. Essentially, they could be anything except black African. This was a deliberate effort to claim the glories of ancient Egypt, its pyramids, its science, its art for a non-African heritage. It was a story built not on evidence, but on prejudice. A story that said incredible achievements couldn't have come from the African continent. But the evidence, if you actually look at it, tells a very different story. Geographically, Egypt is undeniably in Africa. Historically, it had deep, profound connections with its southern neighbor, Nubia, a civilization recognized for its powerful black African kingdoms. The two cultures were intertwined, sharing trade, traditions, and even dynasties. You can see it right there in the art. Look closely at the statues, the tomb paintings, the reliefs. You'll find features that are unmistakably African. Full lips, broad noses, and diverse skin tones ranging from light brown to deep black. Who's like UD find across the continent today. They weren't trying to hide who they were. They were depicting themselves. The most powerful evidence, however, has come from modern science. Recent DNA studies on ancient Egyptian mummies have started to paint a clearer picture. And guess what? They confirm substantial sub-Saharan African ancestry. The genetic links to populations in East and West Africa are undeniable. The science is finally catching up to what the geographies, the art, and common sense have been telling us all along. So why the desperate attempt to deny this reality? It boils down to pride and prejudice. The colonial era mindset couldn't accept that a black African civilization could be the architect of such genius. Admitting the truth would have shattered the racist foundations that justified exploitation and colonialism. So they created a fantasy, a historical fiction, where Egypt was an island of non-Africans in the middle of Africa. It's a powerful reminder of how false narratives can be constructed to serve an agenda, and how vital it is to question the histories we've been taught and seek the truth for ourselves. Think about it for a second. If you spend your entire life hearing things like, ancient Egypt wasn't really African, or Egyptians were a separate, unique race, or the classic, well, their race is uncertain. Then suddenly all those broken noses on the statues start to make a twisted kind of sense. They serve a new purpose. They help sell a lie, because now people can look at these incredible artifacts and just shrugged, saying, see, we can't really tell what they looked like. And that's the point. That manufactured uncertainty is convenient, a little too convenient, don't you think? It allows a false narrative to take root and grow, overshadowing the truth. This wasn't just a physical act of vandalism. It evolved. It became academic. It became cultural. It became psychological. The goal was never just to break stone. It was to break our confidence, to break the connection between a people and their heritage. They systematically created a narrative that made generations of African children and children of the diaspora grow up with a profound sense of emptiness, thinking, we didn't build anything great. We didn't invent anything important. We never led world-changing civilizations. Can you even begin to imagine how devastating that is? To be taught to believe that your ancestors contributed nothing of significance, that their story is one of absence and not achievement, when in reality, their greatness didn't just exist. It fundamentally shaped the world we live in today. From mathematics and architecture to medicine and philosophy, the foundations were laid in the Nile Valley. So, let's call this what it really is. This isn't just misinformation or a historical debate. This is a deliberate, calculated act of identity theft on a global scale. It's the theft of a legacy, the theft of pride, and the theft of truth. For centuries, this theft was supported by something called scientific racism. This was a pseudoscience used by European thinkers during the colonial era to create a hierarchy of races, with themselves conveniently at the top. They looked at the monumental achievements of ancient Egypt, the pyramid, the complex writing systems, the advanced astronomy, and they simply couldn't accept that black Africans were responsible. It didn't fit their prejudiced worldview, so they invented theories to explain it away. They claimed the Egyptians were a lost white race, maybe from Atlantis, or Caucasians who migrated into Africa. They meticulously measured skulls and analyzed features through a biased lens, all to prove a predetermined conclusion: that greatness could not come from Africa. This academic dishonesty seeped into museums, textbooks, and documentaries. Think about the classic Hollywood depictions of Egyptians. They are almost never portrayed by actors of African descent. Cleopatra, Nefertiti, the great pharaohs there, shown with European features, reinforcing the lie that Egypt is somehow separate from the African continent it is firmly a part of. This isn't an accident. It's the visual legacy of that same identity theft. Every time a statue's features are described as ambiguous, or a mummy's DNA is interpreted through a Eurocentric framework, that theft continues. But here's the powerful part. Truth has a way of enduring. The evidence has always been there, written in their own words and depicted on their own temple walls. The ancient Egyptians called their land Kemet, which means the Black Land, a reference to the rich, dark soil of the Nile, but also a reflection of how they saw themselves. Greek historians, the so-called fathers of Western thought like Herodotus, traveled to Egypt and described the people they met. They didn't mince words. They described the Egyptians as having dark skin and woolly hair. They compared them to the Ethiopians. There was no ambiguity in their eyes. The linguistic evidence is also undeniable. The ancient Egyptian language belongs to the Afro-Asiatic language family, with its closest relatives found in Northeast Africa. The culture, the spiritual beliefs, the artistic traditions, they all have deep roots in the African continent. This wasn't an alien civilization that crash-landed in Africa. It was a civilization that grew out of Africa, by Africans, for Africans. Acknowledging this isn't about rewriting history. It's about correcting a historical record that was deliberately falsified. It's about restoring a stolen legacy. So why does this matter so much today? Because representation is not just a buzzword. It's about seeing your potential reflected in the stories of the past. When a child learns that their ancestors mapped the stars, developed written language, and built wonders that still baffle engineers today, it ignites a spark. It replaces a narrative of lack with a legacy of genius. It dismantles the psychological chains of inferiority that were forged over centuries of lies. Reclaiming the African identity of ancient Egypt is an act of empowerment. It's a statement that says, we were there, we were leaders, we were innovators, and that same greatness, that same brilliance, still flows within us today. It's time to stop letting them get away with the greatest identity theft in human history. The truth is our birthright. But here's the beautiful thing about truth. It waits. It survives. It refuses to die. For centuries, a story was told about ancient Egypt, a story crafted not from evidence, but from prejudice. A story that tried to erase the identity of a civilization, to paint it in a color that fit a false narrative. They used what they called science, but it was just bias dressed up in a lab coat. They measured skulls, they analyzed art through a distorted lens, and they twisted history to fit their agenda. They wanted to claim this incredible legacy, to disconnect it from its true African roots. They literally chiseled away at the features of statues, trying to physically alter the past. It was a systematic effort to rewrite history, to build a lie so big it might just become the truth. But truth has a way of holding on, because eventually, real science shows up. Not the biased pseudoscience of the past, but the rigorous, evidence-based science of today. Genetics, archaeology, carbon dating, linguistics. These aren't just fancy words. They are tools of truth. They are keys that unlock the past as it actually was, not as some wanted it to be. Evidence that can't be twisted so easily. And suddenly, the old lies start cracking, just like those statues. Except this time, the cracks reveal the truth underneath. Modern genetics has allowed us to analyze the DNA of ancient mummies, connecting them directly to modern North and East African populations. It's not a theory anymore. It's written in the very code of life. Archaeological discoveries continue to unearth artifacts that scream of their African origins, from pottery styles to burial customs. Carbon dating places these finds squarely in their timeline, leaving no room for doubt. And linguistics, the study of language, traces the roots of the ancient Egyptian language deep into the Afroasiatic family tree. Each discovery is a hammer blow to the crumbling wall of falsehoods. The narrative is changing, not because of opinion, but because of facts. The people who built the pyramids, who created this magnificent civilization, are finally having their true story told. It's a story of an African people, brilliant and innovative. It's a reminder that history belongs to everyone, and no one has the right to steal it. The real science, the real evidence, is putting the pieces back together, restoring a picture that was deliberately broken. The truth was always there, waiting patiently under layers of lies, and now it's shining through. So, we've peeled back the layers on this long, complicated story. We started with the ancient conquerors, the first to impose their will on Egypt's legacy. Then, we moved into the colonial era, where museums became vaults for plundered artifacts, their labels telling stories that served the empires, not the truth. And finally, we uncovered the ugly chapter of scientific racism, where fake science was used to systematically erase the true identity of the ancient Egyptians, twisting their image to fit a prejudiced worldview. But even after exposing all of that, one crucial piece of the puzzle remains. Because this isn't just ancient history we're talking about. It's happening right now, in our modern times. The statues are still housed in foreign museums, thousands of miles from their homeland. The labels are still misleading, perpetuating the old, false narratives. The heritage of an entire civilization remains fragmented and separated from its people. So, the biggest question is, what happens next? Who gets to tell the real story of ancient Egypt now? And how do we even begin to reclaim what was deliberately erased? That's where we're heading in the final part of this journey. This is no longer just about understanding the past. It's about actively shaping the future. It's a story of restoration, of return, and ultimately, of reclaiming the true face of history. Stay with us as we explore the fight for justice and the powerful movement to bring Egypt's heritage home. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Explore African History Relived channel for more of deep dives. For thousands of years, stone has watched silently. It has seen civilizations rise and fall, felt the sting of sandstorms, and endured the thunder of invasions. These statues, these monuments, they stood through the rise of empires and the weaving of lies. They stood against the sharp strike of the chisel and the quiet shame of theft. They stood even as they were crated up and shipped away, destined for foreign museums. They stood even as textbooks were written that forgot their names, that erased their context, that rewrote their very meaning. Still, they stood. Broken, yes, but standing. Damaged, absolutely, but present. They were more than just artifacts. They were silent witnesses, holding a truth that time and human hands tried desperately to bury. They were waiting for centuries, through the noise and the silence, for someone, for anyone, to finally look upon their weathered faces and ask the one question that matters most. What really happened here? Today, we are those people. We are asking that question. We are peeling back the layers of propaganda and colonial narratives that have shrouded Africa's history for far too long. We're looking past the caricatures and rediscovering the brilliant, complex, and powerful civilizations that thrived across the continent. This isn't just about correcting history. It's about reclaiming an identity. Think of the Great Zimbabwe, a magnificent stone city that flourished for centuries, a center of trade and power, or the University of Timbuktu, a beacon of knowledge in the medieval world, housing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on astronomy, medicine, and law. These weren't primitive societies. They were epicenters of innovation and culture. The faces on these ancient statues were not just art. They were kings, queens, scholars, and scientists. Their noses were chiseled off, their features altered, in a deliberate attempt to disconnect them from their descendants, to sever the link between modern Africans and their glorious past. It was an act of cultural vandalism designed to justify subjugation. But the truth, like these stones, is resilient. Archaeologists, historians, and African scholars are now piecing together the real story. They're using advanced technology to analyze what remains in ancient texts, to give voice to the voiceless. We are learning that ancient Egypt was an African civilization, that the kingdom of Kush rivaled its northern neighbor in power and influence, and that trade routes connected Africa to the rest of the world long before European ships arrived. This is a journey of restoration. We are restoring the faces, the names, and the narratives. By telling the true story of Africa, we are not just rewriting history books. We are rewriting the future. We are empowering a new generation with the knowledge of their heritage, a heritage of strength, ingenuity, and profound humanity. There's something incredibly powerful about the truth. You can try to bury it deep beneath layers of lies and misconceptions. You can chip away at it, piece by piece, hoping to diminish its form. You can steal it, claiming it as your own or hiding it away in foreign museums and private collections. You can even try to rename it, giving it a new identity that serves a different story, a story that isn't its own. But here's the thing you can never, ever do. You can't erase it forever. Truth has this strange, persistent habit of resurfacing, of fighting its way back to the light. It's like a magnificent statue, buried for centuries under the shifting sands of time, slowly emerging as the winds of change blow. Its form, though weathered, is unmistakable. Its presence, undeniable. It's like an archaeologist's brush, gently sweeping away the dust and debris from a long-lost artifact, revealing the intricate details of a face that was thought to be gone forever. Each stroke of the brush brings back a feature, a story, a piece of a much larger, more beautiful picture. It's the face of a continent, the face of Africa, emerging from the shadows of a distorted history. This process, this uncovering, is like memory coming home. It's the return of stories that were silenced, the revival of cultures that were suppressed, and the restoration of a dignity that was stolen. For too long, the narrative of Africa has been written by others. The story told was one of darkness, of lack, of a people without history. But that was never the truth. The truth is a story of powerful kingdoms and brilliant empires. It's a story of groundbreaking innovations in science, mathematics, and astronomy. It's a story of profound philosophies, complex societies, an art that has inspired the world for millennia. The Benin bronzes, the walls of Great Zimbabwe, the scripts of ancient Ethiopia, these aren't just artifacts. They are paragraphs and chapters in a grand, epic novel that is still being written. We are now living in a time of incredible awakening. A generation is rising, armed with knowledge and technology, and they are reclaiming the narrative. They are the digital storytellers, the historians, the artists, the curators, and the activists who are piecing together the scattered fragments of their heritage. They are digging through archives, translating ancient texts, and using social media to share the truth with the world. This isn't just about correcting the past. It's about building a new future. It's about showing the world, and more importantly, ourselves, the true face of Africa, face of resilience, of creativity, of strength, and of boundless potential. And that's exactly what's happening now. All over the world, something is changing. It started quietly, a whisper in the halls of academia, a flicker of doubt in a dusty archive. But now, it's getting louder. A new generation of young historians is stepping up, and they're not just accepting the old stories. They're asking new, tougher questions. They're challenging the narratives we've been told for centuries. And here's the most exciting part. African scholars are now leading their own excavations. For the first time, they are the ones unearthing their own history, interpreting the artifacts, and telling their own stories from their own perspective. They're not waiting for permission or validation from anyone else. They're taking control of their own past. This is a monumental shift. Researchers are going back, rereading old colonial field notes, and they're finding things that don't add up. They're noticing major inconsistencies, omissions, and biases that were overlooked, or maybe ignored for a very long time. They're looking closer at those famous, damaged statues we've all seen in museums. You know, the ones with the missing noses and broken features. They're zooming in on the tool marks left behind, studying the fractures, analyzing exactly where and how the breaks happened, and they're all realizing something undeniable. This wasn't just the passage of time, the damage, the vandalism. It wasn't an act of nature. It wasn't a mystery lost to the ages. It was deliberate. It was people, specific people, with specific agendas, made specific decisions to erase a history. We're talking about specific eras of targeted erasure. A systematic campaign to deface and devalue an entire continent's heritage. The story has always been that these features were fragile, that they broke off accidentally during excavation or transport. But the evidence is telling a different, much darker story. It points to a conscious effort to remove the distinctively African features from these incredible works of art. And once you name it, once you call it what it is, an act of cultural vandalism, an attempt to rewrite history by force, it loses its power. Once you expose the lie, you can begin to reclaim the truth. The story of Africa is not one of passive decay. It's a story of survival, resilience, and now, restoration. We are witnessing the beginning of a historical reckoning, a moment where Africa's true face is finally being restored, and its real story is being rewritten by its own people. Thanks for watching. Follow for more as we uncover the truth together. Technology is a powerful ally in this journey of rediscovery. Modern science is giving us a lens to see what older scholars, perhaps deliberately, overlooked. We're talking about game-changing tools like DNA testing, satellite imaging, advanced facial reconstruction, and even pigment analysis on ancient artifacts. These aren't just fancy gadgets. They are instruments of truth, cutting through centuries of myth and misinterpretation. Let's take a look at one of the most exciting frontiers: ancient DNA. For years, the origins of many of Africa's great civilizations, like ancient Egypt, were clouded in debate, often with a clear bias to separate them from the rest of the continent. But now, scientists can extract DNA from mummies that are thousands of years old. And what are they finding? The results are shattering old narratives. They're discovering undeniable genetic links to sub-Saharan African populations. Not just weak connections or vague theories, but strong, clear links. This isn't guesswork anymore. This is data. This is hard evidence. This is scientific proof. What is truly amazing is that this cutting-edge science is confirming what the art has been telling us all along. Those statues, with their distinct features, the reliefs on temple walls, the portraits on sarcophagi, were never silent. They were historical documents carved in stone and painted with truth. It's almost poetic when you think about it. The art and the ancestors told the story first. Science, after all this time, is just catching up to confirm it. The faces of ancient Africa were always there, waiting for the world to be ready to see them for who they truly were. And this is just the beginning. With every new satellite image revealing a lost city, and every DNA sequence decoded, we are piecing together a more accurate, more complete picture of Africa's glorious past. We're not just rewriting history, we're reclaiming it. We are restoring the faces and voices that were silenced, and ensuring their legacy shines brightly for generations to come. This is more than just academic research. It's an act of restoration, a powerful testament to the resilience of truth. Walk into some museums today, and you might notice something different. It's subtle, but it's there. Look closer at the displays, at the artifacts housed behind glass. You'll see new labels, new descriptions. Words that weren't there before are starting to appear. Words like African civilization. Phrases like Nubian dynasty and Kushite rulers. For decades, the narrative has been controlled, distorted. The immense contributions of African civilizations were often minimized, mislabeled, or ignored entirely. Ancient Egypt was frequently presented as separate from the rest of the continent, its African roots erased. The great empires of Kush, Aksum, and Great Zimbabwe were relegated to footnotes, if mentioned at all. But that's starting to change. Slowly, but surely. This shift isn't happening because of a sudden change of heart from institutions. It's happening because the pressure is growing. Communities, scholars, and activists are demanding answers. They're demanding the return of stolen artifacts, and most importantly, they're demanding respect for the truth. The stories of Africa's past are rich, complex, and profound. We're talking about pioneers in mathematics, astronomy, architecture, and medicine. The Timbuktu manuscripts, for example, reveal a world of advanced scholarship in West Africa that rivaled any in the world at the time. The intricate Benin bronzes tell stories of a sophisticated royal court and a powerful kingdom. These aren't just objects, they are a legacy. Restoring Africa's face means more than just changing museum labels. It's about rewriting the story in our history books, in our classrooms, and in our collective consciousness. It is about acknowledging the full scope of human history and giving credit where it has long been denied. It's about understanding that Africa was not a continent waiting to be discovered, but a vibrant tapestry of kingdoms, cultures, and innovations. This process is still not perfect. It's still frustratingly slow. But every new label, every corrected description, every returned artifact is a victory. It's a step toward a more honest and complete understanding of our shared human story. The pressure is working. Let's keep pushing for clarity, for honesty, and for the restoration of a history that belongs to everyone. Have you ever walked through a museum in London, Paris, or Berlin and felt a strange sense of disconnect? You see these magnificent African statues, these intricate masks, these stunning royal artifacts, and you're told they're part of world history. But are they? Or are they African history, held captive thousands of miles from home? For centuries, the story of Africa has been told by everyone except Africans. It's a story of discovery by outsiders, a story of so-called primitive art, a story where the continent's own achievements are often footnotes in someone else's history book. This narrative has been shaped by the very powers that took not just land and resources, but also Africa's historical elites artifacts. Think about the sheer scale of it. It is estimated that 90 to 95% of Africa's material cultural legacy resides outside the continent. 95%. Let that sink in. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of items. The Benin bronzes. In the British Museum, masterpieces of metallurgical art. The Bangwa Queen from Cameroon. A sculpture so full of life, it feels like it could speak. The Rosetta Stone, a key to ancient Egypt, sitting in London. These aren't just objects. They are witnesses to history. They are libraries of knowledge. They are ancestral voices carved in wood, cast in bronze and woven in fabric. And for too long, they've been silenced, locked away in foreign storerooms or displayed with labels that strip them of their true contexts and meaning. But something is shifting. There's a word that's gaining momentum, a word that carries the weight of justice and the promise of a new beginning. Repatriation. It means bringing these artifacts home, back to the land where they were created, back to the communities whose ancestors they represent. Because how can African history truly be taught and understood when its most important textbooks are locked away in European basements? How can a new generation of African children connect with their heritage when that heritage is displayed behind glass in a foreign country, often misunderstood and mislabeled? These objects are not mere curiosities. They are the tangible proof of Africa's glorious past. They are identity. They are memory. They are dignity. And dignity belongs at home. The argument against repatriation has always been that African nations do and have the facilities to care for these artifacts. It is an argument rooted in the same old colonial mindset, idea that Africa is incapable of managing its own legacy. But look at what's happening on the continent today. New, world-class museums are rising. The Museum of Black Civilizations in Dakar, Senegal. The Edo Museum of West African Art in Nigeria, designed specifically to house the returning Benin bronzes. These aren't just buildings. They are declarations of sovereignty. They are institutions built by Africans, for Africans, ready to welcome their history home. The narrative that Africa isn't ready is an excuse. And it's an excuse that's running out of time. The conversation is no longer about asterisk if asterisk these artifacts should return, but asterisk how asterisk and asterisk when asterisk. Imagine the ripple effect of this return. Picture a young girl in Ghana walking into a museum in Accra and seeing the golden regalia of the Asante kings, not as a photograph in a book, but right there, gleaming in front of her. Imagine a student in Ethiopia learning about the Aksumite Empire, not from a Western documentary, but by standing before the very artifacts that prove its power and ingenuity. When you see greatness that looks like you, that comes from your own people, something profound changes inside you. You stand a little taller. You dream a little bigger. The lie that your history began with colonialism evaporates. You realize you don't come from nothing. You come from kings, queens, scholars, and innovators. You come from everything. This is about more than just correcting a historical wrong. It's about building a future where African identity is defined by Africans themselves, where the stories told in museums, in Lagos, Kinshasa, or Addis Ababa are rich, authentic, and empowering. Repatriation is an act of healing. It's stitching back together the torn pages of a magnificent story. It is about giving the ancestors their voice back and ensuring the children of tomorrow can hear them loud and clear. This is the movement to restore Africa's face and rewrite its story in its own words. The journey is long, but the return has begun. That's why this conversation matters so much. This isn't just about statues, and it was never just about broken noses on ancient monuments. It's about the narrative. It's about who controls the story. Because whoever controls the story ultimately controls how people see themselves, their past, and their future. For centuries, Africa's story has been told almost exclusively by outsiders. It was a story that was filtered, edited, and often softened to fit a particular agenda. Key details were conveniently erased. Great achievements were downplayed, and entire histories were This created a distorted image, a caricature that has lingered for far too long, impacting perceptions both within the continent and around the world. But things are changing now. Africans are taking back the pen. They are telling their own stories, in their own voices, with their own perspectives, all across the continent and the diaspora. A powerful movement is underway. Scholars are unearthing buried histories. Creators are bringing ancient glories to life through art, film, and digital media. Teachers are rewriting curriculums to reflect the truth of Africa's contributions to civilization. YouTubers are reaching millions, dismantling old myths, one video at a time. Researchers are piecing together the evidence that was once dismissed or ignored. Everywhere you look, voices are rising. They are rising with a clear, unified message. No more half-truths, no more silence, no more stolen credit. It's a declaration that Africa's story will no longer be a footnote in someone else's book. It is a main event, a rich and complex saga, filled with triumphs, innovations, and profound wisdom. This isn't about rewriting history to be something it wasn't. It's about restoring it to what it always was. It's about presenting a full, honest, and complete picture. It's about acknowledging the incredible legacies of empires like Kushaksum, Mali, and Great Zimbabwe. It's about celebrating the intellectual giants from centers of learning like Timbuktu. It is about recognizing the scientific and mathematical genius that gave the world some of its earliest and most enduring innovations. This is a journey of reclamation. It's about restoring the face of Africa, not just in stone and artifacts, but in the minds and hearts of people everywhere. It's about ensuring that future generations grow up with a story that empowers them. A story that is whole, true, and undeniably theirs. The real story of Africa is being told, and it's more powerful than you can imagine. Think back to where we started this journey. Remember those images? The statues with broken noses, the faces chipped away by time and by force. At first glance, what did you see? I saw loss, destruction, a history that felt like it was crumbling into dust. It looked like an attempt to erase a people, to make them forget who they were. It felt like a story of defeat. But now, after everything we've uncovered, I see them completely differently. And I hope you do too. Those broken noses aren't just scars of the past. They mean something else entirely. They are evidence, not evidence of weakness, but evidence of fear. Think about it. Why would anyone go to such lengths to deface a statue, to break its nose, to alter its features? You only try to erase something when you are profoundly afraid of its power. Nobody bothers to chip away at something they see as insignificant or weak. They chip away at greatness. They attack symbols of strength, of heritage, of a truth that threatens their own narrative. Those broken noses are a testament to the power that these images held, the pride they inspired, and the history they represented. It was a history so potent, so undeniable that colonizers and invaders felt they had to physically destroy it to maintain their dominance. They weren't just breaking stone, they were trying to break a spirit. They were attacking a legacy of kings, queens, scholars, and innovators. They understood that if a people know their history, if they see their own greatness reflected in the art of their ancestors, they cannot be easily controlled. A people with a proud past will always demand a dignified future. That's the real threat. Greatness threatens lies. The very existence of these powerful African likenesses was a direct contradiction to the colonial narrative of a continent without history or civilization. So they broke the noses. They tried to rewrite the story by force, to make the faces less African, less powerful, less real. But they failed. Because the truth is resilient. It survives in the fragments, in the stories passed down, in the scholarship that pieces it all back together. And it survives. And every time we learn, every time we share this history, we are rebuilding what was broken. We are restoring the face of a continent and reclaiming its true story. Those statues, even in their damaged state, are not symbols of loss anymore. They are monuments to a legacy so formidable that it had to be attacked. They are a permanent reminder that Africa's history is one of undeniable greatness, a greatness that was feared, but could never truly be erased. Have you ever looked at an ancient Egyptian statue and wondered, why are so many noses missing? Was it just time? Erosion? An accident? For centuries, that's the story we were told. But what if I told you that every single broken nose, every chipped feature, isn't a sign of decay, but a deliberate act of erasure, a desperate attempt to rewrite history? Let's unpack this. Imagine a civilization so advanced, so influential. Its art so profoundly beautiful that it challenged the world's perception of power and identity. Now imagine someone else coming along, thousands of years later, and seeing that these powerful figures, these pharaohs, queens, and gods looked undeniably African. What do you do when the evidence of a great black civilization is literally carved in stone, staring you in the face? You can't destroy the pyramids. You can't unbuild the temples, but you can deface the statues. You can break the nose. You can chip the lips. You can try to obscure the features that scream of an African origin. This wasn't random vandalism. It was a systematic campaign. When Napoleon's army arrived in Egypt in the late 18th century, his scholars were baffled. The civilization they found didn't match the one they had read about. So, reports say his soldiers used the Great Sphinx for target practice, blowing off its nose. Why? Because a wide nose was a clear, undeniable marker of African ancestry. By removing it, they could create ambiguity, plant a seed of doubt, and superimpose their own narrative onto Egypt's history. This pattern repeats across countless artifacts. They weren't just breaking stones. They were trying to break a lineage, a connection. They wanted to sever modern Africa from its glorious, ancient past. By making these powerful figures ethnically ambiguous, they could claim their legacy, or at least deny it to its rightful heirs. It was a calculated move to control the historical narrative and, by extension, to justify colonialism and racial hierarchies. But here's the beautiful, powerful irony. Their attempt to erase the truth actually became the ultimate proof of it. Every missing nose is a scar that tells a story. It is a silent testament to the strength and significance of the identity they tried so hard to hide. It screams that African greatness was so real, so undeniable, that it had to be physically attacked. A perfect, intact statue is beautiful, but a defaced one tells a much deeper, more resonant story of survival against all odds. They tried to blur the face, but the outline of greatness remained. They tried to silence the story, but the stones themselves cry out the truth. They tried to rename and rebrand entire civilizations, but the ancestors' spirit remembers. They tried to erase Africa from the pages of history, but Africa endured. It is still here, resilient and proud, ready to reclaim its story. This isn't just about restoring statues. It's about restoring a truth that was stolen. The evidence is right there, in every powerful, defiant, noseless face. And now, the restoration begins. Not just of statues, but of memory, of pride, of truth. Because restoration isn't always physical. Sometimes, it's mental. It's looking at history and saying, we were Terry. We built that. We led that. We created that. We mattered. And we still matter. So next time you walk through a museum and you see a statue with a missing nose, don't just see damage. See survival, see resistance. See a story that refused to die. Because even broken, those statues lasted thousands of years. And if stone can survive that long, imagine how strong the people must have been. Imagine how strong their descendants still are. This is about more than just correcting a historical record. It's about reclaiming a narrative that was forcibly taken. It's about understanding that the deliberate defacement of these artifacts was an attempt to erase a legacy, to sever the connection between a great past and its present-day inheritors. The missing noses, the broken crowns, they weren't accidents of time. They were calculated acts meant to deny the identity and humanity of an entire continent. But they failed. They failed because the truth is resilient. It echoes in our DNA, in our cultures, in the art and music and spirit that flourishes across the globe. Restoring these stories isn't about rewriting history, it's about revealing it. It's about peeling back the layers of misinformation and prejudice to show the brilliant, complex, and powerful civilizations that thrived. It's about telling our children that their ancestors weren't just kings and queens, but innovators, astronomers, architects, and philosophers whose knowledge shaped the world. When we see these statues now, we see a testament to it. We see a people who, despite every effort to break them, left behind a legacy so profound that it couldn't be entirely erased. That strength didn't vanish, it transformed. It's the same strength we see in the artists, entrepreneurs, scientists, and leaders of the African diaspora today, who are building new empires and new legacies. So let's continue this restoration. Let's ask the hard questions. Let's support the creators and historians who are doing this work. Let's celebrate our heritage, not as something lost, but as something that has been waiting patiently to be The face of Africa is not broken. It is a mosaic of incredible strength and a story of a truly unbreakable spirit. They tried to chisel away the evidence, to smash the statues, to deface the monuments, to literally break the nose off of a civilization. For centuries, a story has been told, a story that tried to erase the true face of ancient glory, a story that tried to hide African identity in plain sight. They took hammers to stone, ink to paper, and whispered lies that echoed through generations, attempting to convince the world, and even us, that greatness belonged to someone else. But they failed. You see, the thing about truth is that it's resilient. It's like a river that's been dammed up. It will always find a way through. It seeps through the cracks. It erodes the barriers. And eventually, it bursts forth, powerful and undeniable. And that's what's happening right now. The truth of our history is resurfacing. And now, we are the ones holding the tools. We are the archaeologists of our own story, digging through the layers of misinformation. We are the historians, piecing together the fragments they tried to scatter. We are the storytellers, giving voice to the silent statues, the forgotten kings and queens, piece by piece, artifact by artifact, story by story. We are restoring the picture, voice by voice. We are amplifying the whispers of our ancestors until they become a roar that shakes the very foundations of the old narrative. We are working until the history books, the museums, and the world's imagination finally reflect what has always been true, until history finally looks like what it always was. African, this isn't just about the past. It's about our present and our future. It's about understanding the shoulders we stand on. If this story opened your eyes, don't let it stop there. Share it. Send this video to someone who needs to see it. If it made you think, start a conversation. Talk about it with your friends, your family, your community. Don't let the curiosity fade. And if it made you proud, if you felt that spark of connection to a powerful legacy, then become a teacher. Teach someone else what you've learned, because history isn't just something that's written in dusty books. It lives when we speak it. It thrives when we share it. It becomes immortal when we pass it on. So subscribe to the channel. Stay curious. Keep asking questions. Never accept a version of history that diminishes you. And never, ever let anyone tell you that your ancestors didn't build greatness. They did. They built empires. They pioneered science. They created art that inspires to this day. Have you ever looked at ancient Egyptian statues and wondered why so many have broken noses? For centuries, we've been told it was just the passage of time, accidents, or erosion. But what if that wasn't the whole story? What if it was a deliberate act to erase a truth? A truth about the identity, the features, and the heritage of the people who built one of the world's greatest civilizations. They broke the noses, attempting to sever the connection between a magnificent past and its rightful descendants. They tried to muddle the features, to obscure the evidence, but they couldn't break the truth. It was carved in stone, written in hieroglyphs, and passed down through generations. And now, that truth is finally breathing again. Scholars, artists, and storytellers are piecing it all back together, restoring Africa's face to its rightful place in history. The story is being rewritten, not with lies, but with undeniable facts. Thanks for watching. Have you ever looked closely at ancient Egyptian statues and wondered why so many have broken noses? For a long time, we were told it was just the ravages of time, accidental damage over thousands of years. But what if that wasn't the whole story? What if it was a deliberate act, an attempt to erase a people's identity, to sever their connection to a powerful legacy? They broke the noses, trying to suffocate the past, to make us forget who these great kings, queens, and scholars really were. They tried to break the truth. But a truth this powerful can't be buried forever. It finds a way to breathe again. Today, we are piecing together the fragments, reclaiming our history, and giving a voice back to our ancestors. The truth is finally breathing again, and it's a story the whole world needs to hear. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more.